financial markets. We're going to hear testimony from Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. You see him on your screen there to the left. Also, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and the heads of the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. This is being chaired by Maryland Senator Paul Sarbanes.
The committee will come to order. At the very outset, I want to ask all in the room, we're going to take a moment of silence in remembrance of the many innocent people who have lost their lives as a consequence of these terrorist attacks, and in the hopes that the injured will fully recover. Thank you very much. We convene this hearing this morning in an atmosphere and with a focus very different from that which had originally been planned. Quite some time ago, this hearing was scheduled to begin a series of hearings on financial literacy, a subject which, at least in those days, we all regarded as of critical importance for Americans. And we were going to have it with the three principals in the financial markets: the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The subject, of course, remains of importance, and we will return to it at an appropriate time. Today, however, in the wake of last week's unspeakably savage attacks, we focus on the condition of the U.S. financial markets and the U.S. economy. 10 days ago, we witnessed devastation that words are inadequate to convey. Someday, historians will catalog, analyze, and calculate the terrible losses inflicted by the terrorist attacks directed at New York and Washington. But some losses, families torn apart, communities devastated, will remain forever beyond calculation. At the same time, in the wake of these attacks, we saw the immediate response of our firefighters, police officers, emergency rescue workers, and volunteers. It was a response of impressive resolution and courage, giving the world, as the New York Times in an editorial put it, quote, a vision of the valor and selflessness that is the best face of America. None of us will ever forget their enormous contributions, and I want to pay tribute to their steady courage and sacrifice here this morning. It gave us an inspiring vision of calm determination, of steely resolve, and of unity in a common endeavor. Their example must guide us as we turn to the challenge of rooting out terrorism. They must also guide us as well as we carry on with our fundamental responsibilities, caring for our families, educating our children, doing our jobs in a sustained and productive manner, reinforcing the fundamental strength of our economy and of the financial markets whose functioning is essential to it. In New York, the center of the nation and indeed the world's financial markets, we can see a phoenix rising from the ashes. Given the wreckage in downtown Manhattan, many thought it possible that our markets would not be able to open for business as quickly as they did. The fact that they did and the fact that the infrastructure held on record volume is a tribute to thousands of committed individuals in both the private and public sectors who went back to work under very difficult circumstances, having lost friends, colleagues, neighbors, and in some instances, family members. Our capital markets are the most effective in the world, and our witnesses are to be commended, along with many others, for the role they played in ensuring that the United States financial system continues to operate efficiently. New York remains the world's financial capital. The response of our witnesses here today and others to the crisis was coordinated, timely, and effective. They prevented a bad situation from becoming worse by taking decisive and carefully considered action. This morning we will hear in our first panel from the Secretary of the Treasury, Paul O'Neill. The Secretary has been detained but will be joining us shortly. Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Greenspan, and the Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Harvey Pitt. In the second panel, we will hear from the Chairman and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, Richard Grasso, the CEO of the NASDAQ stock market, Hardwick Simmons, and the CEO and President of the NASD, Robert Glauber. As Chairman of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, Secretary O'Neill has led the interagency coordination of the government's response to the attacks on our financial center. Secretary O'Neill, the administration's point person on fiscal matters, has also been engaged in evaluating the potential effects of last week's events on the U.S. economy, and in particular on the airline and insurance industries. Under Chairman Greenspan's leadership, the Federal Reserve took several critical steps to ensure that the financial community was able to meet its liquidity needs. In addition, the Fed was in consultation with other central banks throughout the world, including the European Central Bank, the Bank of Canada, and the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan, and helped to coordinate the bank regulatory process here at home along with other bank regulators. Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Pitt has done, in my view, an outstanding job over the past 10 days in coordinating industry efforts to reopen the securities markets in the wake of last week's tragic events. Once the scope of damage to our financial community became clear, the SEC quickly issued the relief necessary to enable issuers, exchanges, and securities firms to get back into business. I look forward to hearing about the activities of the agencies and under the jurisdiction of our respective witnesses in detail as we move forward to the testimony. I'll withhold the introduction of the second panel until we actually have them before us. But we look forward this morning to hearing the assessment of our witnesses of the impact of last week's events on the condition of the financial markets, as well as the impact of the economy, the adequacy of our response thus far, and what more needs to be done. And gentlemen, we welcome you before the committee. I'll yield to my ranking member, Senator Graham of Texas.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me begin by thanking you for that wonderful statement, and I'd like to identify myself with it. Last week, we had a terrorist assault on two very visible symbols of America, American capitalism and American democracy. Terrorists obviously believe that by killing innocent people and destroying buildings, that they could destroy ideas. But capitalism and democracy are the crowning achievements of man on this planet. And they're ideas that are not going to be killed. In fact, under assault, they become more powerful and more virulent. I am proud of what we have done since Tuesday, a week ago. I think it has brought out the best in the nation. I would, Mr. Chairman, like to say just one thing about all the people who were killed in the financial center in New York. We have a strange way, I think, in our society of measuring importance. If someone holds an office or someone is highly visible in some activity, we tend to attribute great importance to them. But people, the people who were working at the World Trade Center in the very heart of American capitalism, through their activities, financially helped create millions of jobs and made a contribution far beyond the contribution that most people are ever able to make during their lives. I think that our society tends to value too much what is done in the public sector and tends to value too little what is done in the private sector. Someone who creates 100 jobs has probably done more to promote mankind than many people who are often identified as great contributors to society. I am proud of our financial markets. America is clearly not operating if its financial markets are not open. When our financial markets are open and our democratic government is functioning, America is alive and well. A lot of effort went into getting our markets open again. I want to congratulate Harvey Pitt. I want to thank Chairman Greenspan for his action in providing liquidity. I think overall, given what happened, our markets performed as they always do. They performed remarkably well. And it is a great testament to our system and how well it works. And I have no doubt that while this is a setback in our current effort to get the economy moving ahead, I have no doubt it is a very temporary setback financially, and that the economy will again be booming, and hopefully soon.
Thank you very much, Senator Grant. Senator Dodd.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me begin also by commending you for your opening statement, and thank you for not canceling a hearing that was going to be held on a subject matter that's not insignificant, but obviously the importance of events of the last week or so demand that we spend some time and attention on the subject matter you've raised here today. And I'm grateful as well to our witnesses who are taking some time away to appear before us, and particularly those who are coming up. I know Dick Grasso and Wick Simmons and others who will be here to share their thoughts with us. To those of you in the audience who may be watching this doesn't look like there's a full attention of members here. We should note that a substantial number of our colleagues, I think roughly half the United States Senate, is at this very hour on its way to New York to meet up there with officials in the city and to take a first-hand look at the tragedy. And so I know Senator Schumer particularly was torn about whether or not to be here this morning on a matter that obviously is of deep importance to him, but obviously having been directly affected as he and Senator Clinton have, as our colleagues in the state of New York, has decided he should be there in New York and not here this morning. But we'll have, I know, some comments he'd like to include in the record, Mr. Chairman, regarding this subject matter. Let me just take a thought, or spend a minute on a thought or two, if I could, and to sort of echo Phil Graham's comments as well. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever this morning that our markets and our economy are going to rebound very, very strongly. Terrorists may have decided they could destroy some buildings, but the idea, the naive thought that by destroying lives and buildings you were going to somehow destroy the strength and vitality of U.S. Financial markets is just not the case. And so if nothing else happens here this morning, I hope we can reassure those here at home and around the world that acts of cowardice and evil cannot and will not erode the strength of the backbone of the U.S. economy and our nation's financial markets. So the losses we've suffered here are not the financial losses. The loss of these buildings are certainly of significance, but it's the obvious loss of some 6,000 people. The thousands more have been injured, not to mention the thousands more who will be injured not just physically, but the families. I spent a good part of the last 2 days calling families in my state. We weren't hit as hard as New York or New Jersey, but I don't know the total numbers yet, but I was on the phone with about 40 different families in my state, and many of them from Cantor Fitzgerald, who was particularly hard hit. And some of you may know I just have been fortunate to be a father a week ago today, and to talk to some of these women who have children, 1 and 2, 4, one woman who's about to give birth to a child. How do you begin to calculate the sense of loss that these people will feel for years and years to come? So it's important we talk about the financial implications, but I think all of us need to maybe state again here today and over again our deep, deep concern of the human dimension of this is something that will live with us forever. So, Mr. Chairman, I have great confidence, wonderful respect for the witnesses here. We couldn't be more fortunate to have Alan Greenspan chairing the Federal Reserve. I've said that over and over again. It's been important for a lot of reasons, probably never more important than it is today. And Harvey Pitt, who's new to this job, but certainly not new to the issues at all. Very fortunate to have him as chairing the SEC, and so I have great confidence in our financial leadership in the country. And as the chairman has pointed out, and Phil Graham we're going to hear from others as well this morning who will offer us some ideas of where things are. But ultimately, for those who have any concerns about whether or not this economy or this country are going to survive this, let there be no doubt from this moment forward that we will rebound and we will be stronger than we were before. And so I thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Dodd. Senator Allen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to thank you for holding this hearing on the condition of our financial markets. And those of us from Colorado, our thoughts and prayers are with those who are affected by last Tuesday's tragic events. As we continue to go about the people's business, as a free and open society, we'll never be able to completely eliminate the threat of terrorism, but America's strong, and I don't believe that no terrorist can undermine our country. There's no casualty figure that will come from this that will make us lose our fundamental purpose as a nation and as a people. Despite their best attempts, terrorists have not undermined America. One clear example of the fact is the smooth functioning of our financial markets. And here's what I saw. The World Trade Center housed a number of major financial institutions. Many of them suffered devastating losses, yet they continue to do business. New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ are located only a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. Despite difficulties with power, water, and transportation, trading resumed in a calm and orderly manner less than a week later. Bond markets and banks are also operating smoothly, and the Federal Reserve acted quickly to inject liquidity into the financial system. The SEC also responded promptly and successfully. Although markets are now functioning smoothly, I believe we can learn from these events to better prepare for the future. Such preparation is vital, not only for a potential terrorist attack, but it will also help ensure smooth market operation during natural disasters and other unexpected disruptions. America is united and our financial markets remain the strongest in the world. Our hearts may be breaking, but our spirit and resolve is firmly intact. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today, and I thank you for being here during this difficult time. I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you very much, Senator Allen. Senator Stabenow?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, as my colleagues, thank you very much for holding this hearing. And Chairman Greenspan, Chairman Pitt, thank you very much for being here. We would all rather not be here under these circumstances, and we appreciate your leadership and what you have done in the last week. The gravity of this hearing is as heavy as the grief that sweeps our nation. I have been from one end of Michigan to the other in the last few days, and while many of my friends and neighbors have not directly been impacted, we all grieve in the most profound way with what has happened, and many of us have friends and family who are directly affected. The attack on September 11th was not just an attack on innocent Americans, it was also an attack on our financial institutions and the economy as well. And while, as my colleagues have said, our first goal is to support the families and the victims, and to also find those who are responsible and hold them accountable, we simply cannot then shut down, or will not shut down. We must move forward, and that's why it's so important that we restore consumer and investor confidence and the strength and the resiliency of our financial institutions. And that's why we're here today, and we thank the others that will be speaking today as well. I found inspiring so many stories that have unfolded in the last week. And one of those was the story of Cantor Fitzgerald. who, despite having lost an astounding 700 of their co-workers in the attack on the World Trade Center, threw themselves into restoring their computer networks and communications and were back in business within 48 hours. If that's not the American spirit, I don't know what is. They went back to work not because they weren't devastated, but to honor their friends and their co-workers. While we've had a string of bad economic news following the attack, I think it's important that we emphasize and re-emphasize that the underpinnings of our economy are strong and functioning following this tragedy. Our banking system weathered this storm with little disruption or panic, and I commend Chairman Greenspan for your quick decisions to reassert the discount window, that the discount window was available to meet liquidity needs and to lower interest rates before the market opened. We commend you very strongly for that. And I also appreciate the federal financial regulators' swift work that helped maintain order and stability in our financial system. I also want to commend the many firms like Verizon and their employees who work so hard on tight deadlines to restore the communications infrastructure that was crucial to getting our financial markets up and running again. Despite the destruction, bond trading resumed last Thursday, as we know, and the stock market reopened on Monday, thanks to the hard work of so many people, both within the government and outside of the government. And now as we gear up against terrorism, and we know this could last for years, we have to focus also on our economy, because its strength is what gives muscle to our might. We must bring all the tools of fiscal and monetary policy to bear on getting the economy moving and easing the doubts of the business community and consumers. I work on the assumption that our system is fundamentally strong and that we will become even stronger, and I know our witnesses will bolster that sentiment today. I would just say that as citizens of Michigan have asked me what they can do to help, in addition to the prayers that they are giving continually for the victims and their families and all those involved, I've said to them, when you finish giving blood, when you have given your donation to help the victims, go buy American. And from Michigan, we'd like it to be an American-made car. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Enzi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank you for the rapid change of focus that you had so that we could hold this hearing and make it even more pertinent to the events that we just had. I would also like to commend all of the witnesses today for the leadership that they've shown during the last 9 days. I don't think any of us can truly appreciate the monumental task it was to open the markets Monday morning. I'd also like to commend the entire financial services industry for the commitment they've shown in working with regulators and each other during this trying experience. Their reassuring tone about the stability of our markets has been much needed to calm the fears of those who invest in America's financial systems. If the stability and security of America's markets was ever in doubt, I don't believe anyone could doubt their stability after the September 11th experience. Few financial systems could have sustained the losses of New York City, the financial capital of the world, and after only 5 days, been back and running without any major glitches in the system. The quick responses by our market leaders are a major reason why systems have been phased so little. Also, as the accountant, I'm certain that the financial institutions of this country and following the money will be a key to digging out the terrorists and the activities that have happened, and that'll play a key role. I would also ask that my full statement be in the
It will be included in the record. Thank you very much. Senator Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership over this past week. It was just last Tuesday, Chairman Sarbanes and I sat together upstairs in the Banking Committee hearing room where my colleague had convened a hearing into the failure of the Superior Bank. I walked over from my office in the Hart Building just before 10 o'clock, where I just witnessed on television the unspeakable horror of the collapse of the first of the World Trade Center towers. And despite that tragic backdrop, Senator Sarbanes insisted that we move forward with the hearing. The chairman was defiant that the terrorists would not interrupt our work of overseeing the institutions that support the greatest economy in the world. Today we continue that work.
I might add the police came around and terminated our hearing. And so, but it was designed.
Prudence won over defiance
Yes,
at that
yes.
particular
It was
time.
designed to send a strong message that we weren't going to let the terrorists bring the government to a complete halt.
But today we continue that work, and we will hear from a distinguished panel about the condition of the financial markets following the events of last week. I expect that we'll hear a great deal that will make us proud of our financial system. As we all know, our nation's financial players deserve our respect and thanks for what has been a round-the-clock effort to make sure that our markets have functioned as smoothly as possible. We'll also, I expect, learn more about the critical role our financial regulators play in keeping our system strong. Today, I hope we can reserve some time to thank our regulators for the hard work they do every day to make sure our system can withstand the attacks in whatever form. As chairman of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, I intend to spend a great deal of time over the coming months taking a look at our nation's banks and financial institutions. And while we have so much to be proud of, our system is strong because of our constant vigilance. We have a responsibility to learn as much as we can from the lessons of this past week to make our system even stronger. We should identify areas where we can do better, have an open discussion between industry and government to determine how we can work together on these issues. I'm proud of the way our government has responded to last Tuesday's attacks, and while nothing we can do in any way compares to the heroism shown by our firefighters, police officers, and rescue workers, we've had an important role to play in responding to this terrible crisis. I want to take just one moment to mention my Unity Bonds proposal, which the Senate passed last night. As we in Congress know, many of the best ideas come from our constituents. And I'm pleased to give credit to a citizen from my state of South Dakota who called my office to ask if he could buy bonds to show his unity with the victims of terrorists and to support our struggle against those terrorists. Based on this constituent's idea, I introduced legislation which directs the Treasury Department to issue unity bonds. The revenue raised from these bonds is to be used to fund our recovery efforts from last week's attacks and also to fight our ongoing war against terrorism. I'm pleased that the Senate passed this measure last night, just 3 days after I introduced it, and I intend to continue working closely with my Democratic and Republican colleagues to make sure that this legislation is in fact enacted into law. I've received an overwhelming response from constituents who want to know what they can, when they can invest in America through unity bonds. One county commissioner from New York even called to find out whether unity bonds would be available in time for a drive they're having this week to encourage people to invest in America through savings bonds. And just yesterday, I would note that a major credit card bank announced its intention to purchase $10 million of these bonds as soon as they become available. America deserves leadership that can work together and leadership that can work quickly. Mr. Chairman, this hearing will allow the Senate Banking Committee to identify ways that we can respond to the needs of our financial institutions and the markets. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and to working with my colleagues on a bipartisan fashion to respond to the issues that we can identify today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Hagel.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to thank the private and public leadership of our country, including our witnesses this morning. That leadership represents the strength and goodness of this country. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing us an opportunity to have this leadership representing the dynamics and the strength of our country to come before us today, and I look forward to their testimony.
Thank you very much, Senator Hagel. Senator Bai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I speak for myself and everybody else in the room when I say we're looking forward to hearing from our distinguished guests today, so I will make 3 very brief points. First, to echo the words of my colleagues, I want to thank the gentlemen who are with us for your leadership during this difficult time. Consumer and investor confidence is topic A right now, and I can't think of a greater source of reassurance for the American people than to have men of your stature and experience in the positions that you currently hold. And so I want to thank you for your service to our country. Secondly, the events of the past week should remind all of us of the resiliency of the financial markets and the economy of this country, but also of the global interdependence and possibly some of the vulnerabilities of our systems. And I know that we'll go forward from here to focus on those to make sure that we are prepared to meet any future contingencies of this unfortunate type. Finally, I would just like to say, once again, speaking to the confidence of the public, The long history of this country should give all of us optimism about the future. We have overcome a civil war, world war, periods of Great Depression, social instability, even the assassination of some of our country's leaders, and yet the American economy and people have thrived and overcome. And I'm confident when the history is written about the events of the past week, this will be another episode in the resiliency of the American people as we move forward to an even more prosperous and secure society. And again, I want to thank you for your leadership during these difficult times.
Thank you very much, Senator Bai. Senator Bunning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you for holding this very important hearing today, and I would also like to thank our witnesses for testifying. I also would like to thank our witnesses for their leadership in reopening our markets. The nation and the world owe you a debt of gratitude. I cannot put into words the sorrow that I and the people of Kentucky feel. We are sad, confused, frightened, and angry. Our deepest sympathies go out to the victims, their families, friends, and everyone who have been affected by this tragedy. But I also cannot put into words the pride we all feel. Our nation has responded. The overwhelming generosity and patriotism both at Ground Zero and all over this country have moved me in a way I cannot articulate. I commend all of you for your Herculean efforts to reopen our markets on Monday. It was very important to show that we have the will to open the markets in spite of the threats and attacks. I would like to start by commending Dick Grasso, not just for the leadership he has shown in getting his market opened, but for giving the Amex space in his building to operate their market. I am not sure the American people are aware of that fact. By allowing the Amex to compete in the facilities shows the cooperation we have on Wall Street and our nation's commitment to freedom and open markets. I would also like to thank Mr. Simmons and Mr. Glauber for their hard work and for all the assistance they have given. I cannot say enough about Harvey Pitts. We knew we had the right man for the job when President Bush sent your nomination up here to the Congress, but if anyone had any doubts before, surely they have been erased. Now, just knowing that you were on the watch last week made me and countless others in the financial community feel better. I would also like to thank Secretary O'Neill and the Department of Treasury for their swift response and decisive action, both in the extensive law enforcement actions and also in the smaller moves such as the tax relief steps the IRS has taken. The last things the victims or their families should have to worry about right now are taxes. Finally, it is no secret I am probably the biggest critic of Chairman Greenspan on this committee and maybe in the entire Congress. But I must commend the Fed's action starting last Tuesday, opening the discount window, stabilizing currencies, and the 50 basis point rate cut were bold and necessary moves that you could be commended for. Finally, I should like to note that our other markets were open last week also. The Chicago Board of Trade, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange were both open last week, and the bond markets also did a fantastic job in getting back to business last Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the meeting.
Thank you, Senator Bunning. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, Secretary O'Neill, you've missed most of the opening statements. We're glad that you were able to join us here. And to our chairman, Chairman Greenspan, and
We
Chairman
could
Pitt.
repeat them.
I actually, I was thinking of doing that myself, but I won't. A lot of eloquence here at this table, and a lot of excellence at the table of our witnesses. And just to sort of sum up, and then we're anxious to hear from you, I think there are really four daunting tasks that face us as a nation coming out of the tragedies of last week. And one of those is one that Senator Dodd alluded to. I've been seeking to comfort the families in my little state who've lost loved ones, and to help them begin the difficult task of rebuilding their lives. The President will talk tonight about the efforts underway to track down and to ferret out those who have perpetrated these crimes and to bring them and those who harbor them to justice. Down the road a ways, we'll begin rebuilding the physical structures that have been destroyed in Northern Virginia and in New York City. And last week began literally within hours of the destruction of the World Trade Centers and the loss of all those lives, began the hard work of revitalizing an economy that was already on tender hooks. As important as the President's comments are tonight, and I look forward to hearing them as he addresses a joint session of the Congress, your comments today are equally important. We are, as Senator Bai has said, fortunate indeed to have a team as not just as highly regarded as the one that's assembled before us, but a team that is able to work as effectively as you have, and the leadership that you've provided in the last week. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for just for the stewardship that you've provided for our nation.
Thank you very much, Senator Carper. I want to underscore for the record a comment which Senator Dodd made, and that is that there is a Senate delegation that went to New York today, and many of the members of this committee who are not here for this hearing are on that delegation trip, and I just wanted to make sure that that was understood. Secretary O'Neill, we're very pleased you were able to join us. I know you were detained by an important meeting, and we're pleased to have you and Chairman Greenspan and Chairman Pitt here with us. And Mr. Secretary, I think we'll start with your statement and then move right across the table to Chairman Greenspan and Chairman Pitt. We'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm sorry I was detained. I was in a National Security Council meeting, which we're having quite a few of these days as we assemble information and make plans for actions that need to be taken. So I hope you will forgive me for being a few minutes late.
Certainly.
I understand your opening statement was really quite good and touching, and I thank you and other members for the things that you've said. For myself, I do have a prepared statement, and with your permission, I'll simply submit it for the record.
It'll be included in full in the record.
And then I think maybe I'll open myself up for questions. But at the beginning, I would like to say to you how proud I am of my organization and Alan's organization and Harvey's organizations. And you all mentioned Dick Grasso and the people at the New York Stock Exchange and Wick Simmons at NASDAQ and Sal Sedano at American. And I don't know whether anyone mentioned before I came, but all of the firms that make markets were involved in this restart effort. The communications companies, Verizon, the police and the fire people who were working in, especially in downtown New York, were all part of this fabulous recovery process that allowed us to demonstrate to the world that while we took a direct hit in our financial district, we were able to reopen the symbol of America's economy in a very short order. And frankly, I think we did it in just the right time. There were some voices who were clamoring for opening on Wednesday or Thursday or even Friday. I think the right set of judgments were made. We made sure that we would not have a false start. I must tell you, if I had known on Monday morning that we would have the largest day of trading in the New York Stock Exchange as measured by volume that we ever had, I would have had a bigger lump in my throat than I already did. But we did it. And I say that in the fullest sense, we, the American people, did it. And I think we should be proud that we've gotten restarted and we've demonstrated we can do it. It's awfully hard not to also say one additional thing. Monday morning, when Harvey and I were in New York for the restart, it was a very emotional, touching time, and those of you who saw it on television probably got a sense of the emotion radiating out of those faces that were on the floor. But when we went down on the floor after the restart, people just wanted to reach out and touch and say, thank you and God bless you, and tell the President he has our prayers. And it's difficult that tragic events bring us together. For sure they have done that. And not just those of us in the United States, or those of us who were privileged to be on the floor on Monday morning, but every communication from countries around the world has been not only comforting and reassuring and indicating every possible support, but ready to move into action as soon as we tell them what we want them to do. So I think off of this terrible tragedy, we're seeing the best of society around the world coming together with a determination that we will persevere and we will prevail. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to impose on you to just take a moment or two. I think it would be helpful if you put on the public record the parts of your, if you would do the parts of your statement concerning the government securities and the fixed income markets, and the part on the Treasury response with respect to the IRS. I think there are a lot of people watching this hearing this morning, and I think if we can just lay that out for the public record. Now, you also reviewed what the other regulatory agencies could do. I think we can forego that because presumably we'll be hearing from both Chairman Greenspan and Chairman Pitt about the activities of their respective agencies. But I think we want people to understand what's being done and how concerns and needs are being addressed. And if you could take an extra moment or two to do that, I think it would be helpful.
All right, Mr. Chairman, would you say again government securities and which other areas?
And then the Treasury response over on page 4, your IRS tax guidance.
Okay.
And your enforcement things, I think that would be important. And then you might want to say just a word or two about economic recovery and impact, although I'm sure we'll get into that in the question period.
All right, good. Thank you. The Treasury has successfully adjusted its financing needs in the face of the recent market disruptions. The Treasury and other regulatory agencies work closely with the Bond Market Association to reestablish an active and orderly fixed income market. Following a recommendation by the Bond Market Association to close the market on Wednesday, September the 12th, trading resumed in all fixed income markets on Thursday, September the 13th. Further, Treasury was able to execute a successful auction of 3- and 6-month Treasury bills on Monday, September the 17th, with 24 of the 25 primary dealers participating. And I would say we see going forward no concern at all with being able to do appropriate and necessary government financing. The markets there, they're deep. And so we're up and running and will continue to do so. With regard to the Treasury response and specifically IRS tax guidance, the IRS and Treasury are providing relief to all taxpayers directly affected by the terrorist attacks. This relief includes extending the time for filing tax returns and extending the time for making estimated tax payments. The victims of the airplane crashes on the ground and in the air, taxpayers whose workplace or whose records are in a disaster area, relief workers, and taxpayers in all 5 boroughs of New York City and in Arlington County, Virginia, the location of the Pentagon, are among those who qualify for this relief. In addition, the IRS and Treasury are providing relief to taxpayers unable to meet tax deposit obligations because of damage or injury inflicted by the terrorist attacks. Furthermore, for all taxpayers, the IRS has postponed until September the 24th the due date for all federal tax obligations other than deposits of federal taxes that otherwise would be due between September 10th and September 24th. This postponement includes, for example, the filing of returns and the payment of estimated taxes. In the enforcement area, Treasury has established an interagency team dedicated to the disruption of terrorist fundraising. The team is designed to increase our ability to identify foreign terrorist groups, and I would further say individuals, assess their sources and methods of fundraising, and provide information that will make clear to law enforcement officials how terrorist funds are moved. This team will ultimately be transformed into a permanent Foreign Terrorist Asset Tracking Center in the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control. This is an extraordinary effort that illustrates the Treasury Department's creativity in developing new ways to combat terrorists. And I would offer one other thing for the record on this subject. We have resolved that we are going to take an intensive effort to deal with terrorist fundraising like has never been done before. We have assembled and will continue to add to a list of known terrorists and suspected terrorists, both individuals and fundraising organizations who, through intelligence activities, we know have provided financial support. And we, for the first time, will systematically use all the information, intelligence assets that are at the disposal not only of our government, but cooperating governments around the world to begin closing down bank accounts, asking other governments to block accounts, and where there is enough evidence to do it quickly, to confiscate amounts that are in these accounts, so that rather than deal at a high level of abstraction, we're going to go after individuals, individual accounts, and we're going to begin today to block accounts.
Good.
On the subject of economic impact, my prepared testimony has quite a bit here, and I would summarize my view this way. There is no doubt that we have had and are having economic dislocation. Some of them are very obvious. Closing down the nation's airways for a period of time has a severe impact on not only on that industry, but on industries that depend on air service to move parts and supplies and communications. And that's an important dislocation, and there are collateral dislocations that flow from that we all know about. There are obvious questions about the terrorist-inflicted financial damage that will be reflected back into insurance company and reinsurance company processes, and I think we need to look at those very carefully. If you step back, if it's possible to step back and look at our economy in a broader sense, going back to September 10th, and then looking at the prospects going forward, I believe this. I do believe that we were beginning to see the encouraging signs we were all looking for and hoping for, that our economy was going to start growing at a better rate in the days and maybe a few weeks before September the 10th. And, you know, I've heard so many times the last few days, America the Beautiful, and I think about the amber waves of grain, and I remind myself that the amber waves of grain didn't stop growing on September the 11th. And it's a metaphor for saying there are a lot of strengths in the American economy. And while I think we all have a sense of a damaged personal spirit and maybe a hole in our heart that's never going to get repaired, there's still a great strength and a resiliency in this American economy. And I think, as I understand that Chairman Greenspan counseled some members of Congress yesterday, that we need to be sensitive to needs that may develop for additional federal stimulus in one way or another, but that we should give ourselves 10 days or 2 weeks to assess what's going on. Yesterday I talked to one of the major credit card companies, and they told me that on a year-to-year basis their credit card activity was off 20% in the period since a week ago Tuesday. And I think that's clearly to be expected because people stayed home and looked at their television. They were heartbroken. But we will recover. And I think we need to be, on the one hand, deliberate. Where necessary, we need to act with speed. I think there is no doubt that the airline industry has a cash liquidity squeeze, and we need to respond to that. But I think it makes very good sense that we respond with deliberate speed to items that are emergent, and that we give ourselves a consolidation period to think carefully about what we should do. And then my own view is this. I know this is very difficult, because our process has an endless list of things that people would like to do that have been paraded through the weeks and months and years, and they're kind of the favorite chestnuts. I believe that this situation and these events are sufficiently serious that we should be really careful and deliberate in assessing what the needs are, and then responding to the real needs, not to the off-the-shelf political things that have been paraded around that we've all debated and argued about. And I think it's possible to do that. I hope it's possible to do that because it will demonstrate that we are really together and that we are focused on the things that should bring America together. And to the degree that we need to provide additional things, it should be first about what's good for America, what's not good for some group or some interest that's always there waiting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And I'm glad we were able to draw you out a little bit with, in effect, a supplementary statement, which I think was enormously helpful to the committee. We'll take the other two statements before we go to the question period. So, Chairman Greenspan.
First, let me associate myself with the remarks of the Secretary, and I agree that he is raising some very fundamentally important questions which relate to how this government functions and should function. I'd also like to associate myself with everything that's been said by you and the committee. This is an extraordinary time, and I think we're all deeply touched. Indeed, I'd like to begin my remarks this morning by noting how deeply saddened I and my Federal Reserve colleagues are that so many talented and productive people from so many walks of life were lost or irreparably harmed last week. Although we are here today to discuss some of the immediate economic and financial implications of that tragedy, we are all too aware that the topic we discuss will be a mere footnote. The terrorism of September 11th will doubtless have significant effects on the U.S. economy over the short term. An enormous effort will be required on the part of many to cope with the human and physical destruction. But as we struggle to make sense of our profound loss and its immediate consequences for the economy, we must not lose sight of our longer-run prospects, which have not been significantly diminished by these terrible events. Over the past couple of decades, the American economy, as the Secretary indicated, has become increasingly resilient to shocks. Deregulated financial markets, far more flexible labor markets, and more recently, the major advances in information technology have enhanced our ability to absorb disruptions and recover. In the past, our economy has quickly regained its previous levels following the devastation of hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, and myriad other natural disasters that periodically batter various regions of our country. Although the trauma of September 11th shares some characteristics with such disruptions, the differences are important. In contrast to natural disasters, last week's events are of far greater concern because they strike at the roots of our free society, one aspect of which is our market-driven economy. All modern economies require the confidence that free market institutions are firmly in place and that commitments made today by market participants will be honored not only tomorrow, but for years into the future. The greater the degree of confidence in the state of future markets, the greater the level of long-term investment. The shock of September the 11th, by markedly raising the degree of uncertainty about the future, has the potential to result for a time in a pronounced disengagement from future commitments, and that in the short run would imply a lessened current level of activity. Indeed, much economic activity ground to a halt last week. But the foundations of our free society remain sound, and I am confident that we will recover and prosper as we have in the past. As a consequence of the spontaneous and almost universal support that we received from around the world, an agreement on a new round of multilateral trade negotiations now seems more feasible. Such an outcome would lead to a stronger global market system. A successful round would not only significantly enhance world economic growth, but also answer terrorism with a firm reaffirmation of our commitment to open and free societies. But before the recovery process gets underway, stability will need to be restored to the American economy and to others around the world. Arguably, that stability was only barely becoming evident in the United States in the period immediately preceding the acts of terrorism. Aggregate measures of production, employment, and business spending continued to be weak. That said, consumer spending moved higher in August and appeared to be reasonably well maintained in the first part of September. Industry analysts suggest that motor vehicle sales were running close to August levels and chain store sales were only modestly lower. Purchasing managers had noted an improvement in the orders picture in August. Moreover, the dramatic rate of decline in profits was slowing. To be sure, these signs were tentative, but on the whole, encouraging. During the past week, of course, the level of activity has declined. The shock is most evident in consumer markets where many potential purchasers stayed riveted to their televisions and away from shopping malls. Both motor vehicle sales and sales at major chain stores, some of our most current information on consumer spending, appear to have fallen off noticeably. And the airline and travel industries have suffered severe cutbacks. The unprecedented shutdown of American air travel and tightened border restrictions have induced dramatic curtailments of production at some establishments with tight, just-in-time supply chain practices. Automakers, for example, are reported to have pared production and even closed some plants in the past week, largely owing to supply shortages, though doubtless short-term demand uncertainties have also played a part. The effect on financial markets of the devastating attack on the World Trade Center was pronounced, as telecommunications and trading capacities were severely impaired. But the markets are mostly functioning now, albeit in some cases using contingency arrangements, and as in the past, the infrastructure will be rapidly restored. For a brief time, the terrorist attack markedly disrupted payment transfers that are usually measured in terms of trillions of dollars each day. Many obligators temporarily lost their technical ability to pay on time, leaving those counting on receiving payments caught short. The pressures ultimately ended up concentrated in banks. Those needs were met by the Federal Reserve both through record lending at the discount window and through an extraordinary infusion of funds through open market operations. To facilitate the channeling of dollar liquidity to foreign financial institutions operating in the United States, 30-day currency swap lines were arranged with major central banks, again in record volumes. It was essential in such an environment to meet all appropriate demands for dollar liquidity. As the financial markets and payment infrastructure return to normal, loans are being repaid, and the temporarily bloated balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is now shrinking back to normal. Nobody has the capacity to fathom fully how the tragedy of September the 11th will play out. But in the weeks ahead, as the shock wears off, we should be able to better gauge how the ongoing dynamics of these events are shaping the immediate economic outlook. For the longer term, prospects for continued rapid technological advance and associated faster productivity growth are scarcely diminished. Those prospects, born of the ingenuity of our people and the strength of our system, fortify a promising future for our free nation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Greenspan, for a very, very thoughtful statement. Chairman Pitt.
Thank you, Chairman Sarbanes. Chairman Sarbanes, Senator Graham, members of this committee, I very much appreciate the opportunity to offer the perspectives of the Commission on the condition of our financial markets following the terrorist attacks of September 11th. I would like to say, before I begin, how very important and very reassuring it is to have had the support of this committee. I spoke with many of the members of this committee, and I had the insights of many of the members of this committee, which were invaluable. And I'd like to compliment Secretary O'Neill for the leadership that he and the Department of Treasury have provided, and Chairman Greenspan and Vice Chairman Ferguson for their wisdom and their insight into the markets. The attacks that we are here to discuss caused irreparable loss of life and untold physical damage. Like many of you, I lost people I cared deeply about and had known for decades. But these attacks did not destroy or diminish our strength, our courage, or our resolve. We grieve for lost friends and relatives, but we also should be proud of the nation's extraordinary responses to these events, because they demonstrate that our capital markets are the world's strongest and most resilient, and above all, they reflect enormously well on our national character. These attacks did not arise in a vacuum. So we at the SEC coordinated our efforts with the larger federal government, of which we are but a part. And we work cooperatively with the industry that we oversee. This committee has the ability to pass upon the public leaders. The leaders of our private markets are not selected by this committee or by the government. And I do want to say that the esteem and respect that I have for Dick Grasso, Wick Simmons, Frank Zarb, Bob Glauber is enormous. These people rose to the occasion, and they truly epitomized what's great about America. At the Commission, we embrace two critical roles. First, to assist in implementing national policy, and second, to evaluate and then facilitate the industry's planned responses while ensuring fidelity to the protection of investors and national interests. We, along with our colleagues from Treasury, traveled to New York on Wednesday to meet directly with the leadership of major markets, securities firms, banks, and clearing agencies, representatives of the New York's governor and New York mayor, as well as Con Edison, Verizon, and the New York Fed. We assessed the industry's readiness to reopen the markets, Despite the broad powers that this committee has given our agency, we did not dictate a result. Rather, we facilitated an appropriate market solution. The decision when to reopen the markets was made by the private sector in consultation with us and subject to our review, but it was a private sector decision. On Thursday, the fixed income and futures markets successfully resumed trading. That same day, industry representatives unanimously decided to reopen equity and options markets on Monday, not Friday. Deferring the resumption of trading until Monday permitted extensive testing of systems operability and connectivity. Throughout the weekend, our staff worked with market and industry participants, verifying that systems were sound and operational. We reached out to major market participants to formulate appropriate temporary regulatory relief to facilitate the reopening of fair and orderly markets. For the first time, we invoked the emergency powers that you bestowed upon us, and we issued several orders and an interpretive release to ensure an orderly market under these extraordinary circumstances. Government is and must be a service industry, so we made certain we were accessible both to investors and to market participants. We placed additional information for investors and market participants on our website, and we established telephone and internet hotlines for both. I believe this is the first time that we provided for industry participants. We have done this in the past for investors. And we assured industry participants that they could bring us their problems and that we would work with them to find solutions without recrimination, except in cases of venality. And of course, there were none. The result of these efforts was evidenced on Monday, when all of the U.S. securities markets resumed trading without incident. Investors once again relied on the strength and the soundness of our markets. All market and investor protection systems were squarely in place. The markets did not give way to panic selling, and the extra time taken before resuming trading gave investors an opportunity to reflect and to speak out about the strength of America's markets. And the world heard them loud and clear. I appreciate this opportunity to present our views. And in closing, would like to, in addition, again, to repeating the leadership and wisdom that my colleagues here provided for us, to make special reference to the other commissioners at the Commission who were very supportive and helpful in all of this, and to a very wonderful, knowledgeable, and dedicated staff that worked all the way through the weekend, giving of themselves time and time again to help us work with the private sector to get our markets in full operation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Pitt. I say to the members of the committee, given the large number of senators that are present, I would do a five-minute rounds. First, I want to again commend the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the SEC for their response to this situation. All of your agencies have highly skilled, expert people, and that talent was brought to bear. That, in the end, is really the basic strength of our country in both the public and the private sector. And we know that people worked all night, over the weekend, and everything else in order to try to address this situation. I want to underscore our appreciation to them. Secondly, I want to I commend all of you for your consultation with the Congress. which was immediate and continuous, and I think is very helpful in enabling us to make sure that we have a unified view on matters, which I think was important in these days in helping restore matters. Now, I'm reminded a bit of the advice, the medical advice, do no harm, as the first guiding principle. I think my colleague Senator Graham has used that advice on a comment.
I've not lived in vain. Lord's name be praised.
And Secretary O'Neill, in your supplementary statement, you indicated your sort of view about being careful, prudent, I think would be the right word, prudent now in how we move with respect to one or another of the economic proposals that are before the Congress. Chairman Greenspan, you came up yesterday and participated in a hearing, in a meeting with the congressional leadership in which you addressed that subject, and it's reported in the morning paper, but I'd invite you to take a few moments now to give us your view on that matter as well, if you would.
Mr. Chairman, I think that what we know about a situation such as this is that there are a combination of forces impinging on the American economy which we cannot at this particular stage disentangle. Most importantly, we know that there is a combination of infrastructure problems and technical and physical breakdowns that have occurred. And until we can see what the economy looks like without them, appropriate policy initiatives, in my judgment, are premature. We have a very complex, sophisticated economy, and even the slightest aberration ricochets throughout the system. And when you have a devastating impact on the financial system such as we have had here today, which we've been discussing here today, until it works its way through the system, until all institutions are up and functioning, until we find that the just-in-time supply problems which have been occurring as a consequence of the air traffic problems and the border closings, which are not irrelevant to this issue, we will not be able to separate what the underlying demand and supply factors are, and it is they to which we must adjust policy. We know that the infrastructure problems will all be restored and balanced for, so far as the mechanism of the economy is concerned, will be rapidly back in place. But we cannot tell at this stage which is a physical problem which will be reversed in a manner similar to a hurricane or a flood, and which is a more deep-seated underlying problem. And it's the latter, as I indicated, that we have to address. And what I said to your colleagues yesterday, essentially, is that we will know in a reasonably short period of time. The Secretary has said 10 days, a week, 10 days, a little longer. It may be a little longer, but not much longer. And I would strongly suggest that while there is an obvious, very strongly desired sense to move rapidly, that it's far more important to be right than quick.
I think we ought to underscore that there have been a number of policy measures taken over the course of this year. The Fed, in successive reductions of the interest rates, the rebate on the tax rebate that's now going out. Now there's going to be a fiscal stimulus from investment programs to recover, spending programs. Some of those policies I don't think have had a full chance to work their way through. Presumably they are providing some, or were providing, will continue to provide some lift to the economy. So it's not as though those policies had fully worked their way out. Well, let me ask you, can we reasonably look at the situation and say that the impact of those policies may well still be working its way through the economy in terms of giving it a lift in this context? Why don't we hear from both Secretary O'Neill and Chairman Greenspan on that?
I would say that there's no doubt that as a consequence of the actions that the Federal Reserve already took before September the 10th and the coordinated action taken by the Congress to enact the tax program, including the rebate program, have left the economy in much better shape and with possibilities than they would have been without these coordinated fiscal and monetary policy actions. So I think what you say is very, very wise. We need to remember what was already in place as we assess what else we might and should do.
Yeah.
I might just add, Mr. Chairman, that that does not mean that future actions are not going to be required, nor does it suggest that some of the immediate actions, for example, focused on the airline industry, are not appropriate. Indeed, they are, because as I indicated earlier, one of the remarkably sensitive problems we ran into was the extent to which shutting down the essentially American airspace bottled up a huge amount of economic activity all over the country. This was not strictly a New York City issue. And I think that bringing the airlines back, I must say air freight has now come back quite considerably, but there's a whole structure of this economy which rests on air travel, which is important that we bring back as quickly as possible. So it doesn't, what the Secretary and I have been saying, doesn't preclude fairly expeditious action on certain issues. I think what the point the Secretary is making, and which I concur in fully, is that it is very easy in a period such as this, in haste, to do things that in retrospect were not right. I do not think that waiting a short while really materially alters the impact of whatever is done on the economy's pattern of growth over the next several quarters.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Chairman Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just pick up where the chairman left off. I guess the way I look at our situation is that Tuesday, a week ago, things happened that made all 285 million Americans poorer. Whether we're talking about human suffering or whether we're talking about the decline in the value of somebody's teacher retirement program, or whether it was a salesman who found a dramatic restriction on their ability to travel for business purposes, the plain truth is all 285 million people in America, and really everybody in the world, is poorer. The problem we face is that since any assistance we give to anybody comes from the same 285 million people, we're incapable of indemnifying everybody. And for everybody we indemnify, we make everybody else poorer than they were before the indemnification. So the question is, what is the cutoff point? With airlines, there's no doubt about the fact that the smartest decision made Tuesday, a week ago, was to bring every plane down at the nearest airport. A very smart decision. The disruption that cost, the cost it imposed on airlines, was immediate. But the question is, when you get beyond those very narrowly defined costs, if you go too far, then how do you justify not providing assistance to Boeing or to hotels or to restaurants or to people who lost in teacher retirement? I mean, the point is, where do we draw the line? Now, as I look at the administration's proposal for the airlines today, if you look at actual losses to this point, you proposed assistance that are roughly twice that amount. Now, knowing there are going to be losses in the future, I want to pose a question, but I want to ask everybody if they agree with the thesis. this idea that somehow we could settle into a new equilibrium where there's 80% of air traffic as compared to what happened before is a very dangerous idea. I think if I knew that we were going to end up a year from now with 80% air traffic, I would know we were going to have a recession. I mean, the 1% of the people who engage in business travel probably create 20% of the gross domestic product of America. So that idea is unthinkable, and I think rather than bailing out airlines in the future, we need to get them flying. We need to invest in safety. We need to rebuild public confidence, and I believe it'll come back. Now, given where we are with the $5 billion that was proposed in the insurance indemnification, Secretary O'Neill, do you believe we need a loan guarantee, or do you believe that the direct cash assistance is enough so that the airlines that could have made it will find that they're now capable of getting loans?
Well, Senator, as I said earlier, I think in this extraordinary time, we should be very direct about what we're going to do and what we think we need to do. And a loan guarantee, in fact, is a financial instrument that has an economic value. And I personally favor, during these extraordinary times, not dealing with veils and third-order derivatives, if you will, for people who know what that means. I favor, if we're going to give people money, we ought to give them money. And to the degree that there's a belief that we should give the airlines more money for some other reason, I think we should give it to them directly. Now, if you don't mind, I will tell you what I think we should do for the airlines. I think, first of all, to this point of analysis, we need to understand what the problems are and what it is we need to do to get back to a market-determined rate of activity in the airline business. And I would submit to you, first of all, very clearly, there's a liquidity problem. We need to give $5 billion or so in liquidity assistance to the airlines, and we've talked about devices for doing that. I think that we're coming into agreement. Secondly, I believe that we need to socialize the cost of air safety. And by that I mean the federal taxpayers need to pay for the safety that will assure the public that when they get on an airplane, they're going to go where they paid to go without risk of life and limb. It seems to me it's a very straightforward proposition. We should have probably gotten to it earlier. Secondly, in order for the airline companies individually to be economic enterprises, they need to be in a position that they're responsible for things gone wrong that are within their control. And to the degree that that means we have to socialize the cost of insuring against terrorism, we need to do that. But as we do that, we should be the backup guarantor. We should not interfere in the regular process of commerce. And I think if we provide necessary liquidity and if we assure the safety of people who travel by air, that companies that are truly viable will have no problem getting capital infusions from ordinary capital markets. So my counsel would be, as we work on these problems that have come from this tragedy, that we separate out the things that need to be done that are directly associated with this crisis, and that we not, in the process of caring so much, make the mistake of federalizing industries like the airline industry.
Well, if I could just get a yes or no from Secretary O'Neill and Chairman Greenspan, I assume that both of you would strongly agree with the thesis that if we did loan guarantees, that we ought to have a board that has the responsibility of not making loans to people they believe that can't pay them back, and that we should guarantee only a portion of the loan so that the lender has some due diligence and something at risk. Do you both agree with that and agree with it strongly?
Certainly I do. I think, the idea of a loan guarantee suggests that there's a need for a supplemental backup because there's doubt about the the borrower being able to discharge their contractual responsibility. And I would say to you, for companies who, this is personal experience now talking, for companies who are not viable, if you want to give them a loan guarantee, in spite of the fact they're not economically viable, 80% won't do. You need to give them 115% loan guarantee, because only a fool would give a failing company money if you're only going to get 80% of your principal back. And so I would say to you, the idea of loan guarantees make no sense. If we take care of the essential clarity of not putting the airlines at risk for safety things beyond their capability, and we take care of the imposition of the cost of shutting down the airways for 4 or 5 days, viable airline companies will be able to get money from intelligent investors, because that's what intelligent investors do, is give money to people who give them a good return.
Did you, Alan?
I agree with what the Secretary said.
Well, I'm going to turn to Senator Dodd. Let me, as I do that, just let me make this observation. The Congress in the past had loan guarantees for Chrysler, a Lockheed, a New York City. All of those loans were paid back. And in fact, we, in a sense, came out ahead, because obviously, I mean, you know, we have to look at the facts of this circumstance, but that program was structured in such a way that it responded to the crisis that confronted us, but it did it in a way that it worked out so that there was no cost to the taxpayer. Senator Dodd?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me first of all say to the panel again how much I appreciate, we all appreciate your statements. And Secretary O'Neill, your opening comments, if nothing else out of this hearing, I hope people listen to what you had to say regarding the notion of caution and what Chairman Greenspan has said, better to have it right than fast. And because there has been this sense, and a sense of urgency, and understandably, people want to respond. We want to do something. And in our desire to do something, which is understandable, we can do some harm in the process. And I think your wise counsel here to those of us in the Congress who want to respond to our constituencies, who want to help. And it's hard to, when you're in that mood, to sit back and wait a little while as things sort out a little bit. So I am deeply impressed with your statements, all of yours. And Chairman Pitt, you made the same point. You've made the same points, and that's extremely worthwhile. I wanted to say at the opening remarks how deeply impressed I was with the work of Dick Grasso and the exchanges and all of you here in the working groups. And I think you're so right about the Monday decision. Boy, what a difference we would have had if we had had a disruption on Monday or Friday if we'd started, or Thursday. And I think that action alone, that visual of those of you who were there ringing that opening bell on Monday was tremendously important. And I know the market's bouncing around and so forth the last couple of days, but I think those have been very, very important decisions, and I just wanted to restate them again. I'd like to raise a couple of questions. First of all, just to follow up on the line of questioning that Phil has started, I think is an important one. The airline industry. I would hope in your assessment of this, whether you talk about direct investments, let me put a question mark at the end of this rather than try and give you a sort of an editorial comment, is that you're looking at this, you're going to be looking at events beginning on Tuesday, September 11th. Because frankly, there were a lot of problems, in my view, with the airline industry that existed prior to September 11th. And that I would hope that as we try to do things to assess or to correct problems, we're not reaching back further, in a sense, beyond that. Now, that's a difficult thing to do. I'm not suggesting that's an easy task, but I think that's going to be extremely important. Because then I think your job gets a little bit easier, and the point you're making. I think when you talked about Lockheed, and I agree with Chairman Sarbanes about this, and having been here with Phil and others, when we went through the New York City, and we went through Chrysler and so forth, there you were dealing with single entities, and it was easy to get your hands around. Here you're dealing with multiples, where there are varying degrees of good management and success. Some airlines, I think, if they walked in and said, we need the help, based on who they are and who runs it, you wouldn't need much more than that. There are others you might not give a nickel to based on who's running them. So I would hope that as you're looking at that, you'll keep in mind that we're talking September 11th forward as a result of what's happened, and keep that in mind. I wonder if you might as well, since we've talked about the airline industry and sort of where you are in that, in my state, obviously, the insurance industry is a major factor. We've received calls from the industry themselves as to where things are. They seem fairly confident and optimistic they can handle the situation. But I wonder, Mr. Secretary, if you'd sort of give us your assessment of the implications to the insurance industry. But let me point out, by the way, I should have done this, and I for those of you, we got a letter this morning, and I'm sure all of us are going to be getting these. This was from a car livery service in my state. Just again, what the point Phil was making. I hear the airline industry understand, but they're going to lose, according to Susan Garino in my state, 75 to 90% reduction already in sales for them. This is a little company. It's a small business. I understand we're going to come in and airlines are going to be asking for help. What are we going to do for Susan Garino and her business and the 5, 10, 15? And again, I'm not suggesting you can do something for everybody, but you got 11,000 people at U.S. Air lost their jobs, 30,000 at Boeing. I'd like to hear, if I could as well, some comments about what suggestions you'd make in terms of unemployment assistance to people who also have suffered here. And I realize there may be some limits, but it seems to me people who are working hard and doing it, the people in the industry, people at Cantor Fitzgerald, I've talked to some of these people, and they're worried. They had limited partnerships. They got 4 or 5 kids in these situations. Now, you had a huge loss there, but unless it gets a little bit beyond maybe your range of ability, but I think expressing some thoughts about this to the industry leaders as to what might be done could be helpful. So I wonder if you might just make some comments on those 3 or 4 items.
Thank you, Senator. I'm really impressed with your analysis of this situation. And with regard to unemployment insurance, I saw in the newspaper this morning that there's a question about New York State, and I think we should respond, and we will respond as we have on other occasions where we've had strains in the unemployment insurance system. I think there's no doubt together we will work that out. I want to go back, before I talk directly about insurance companies, to this question of the industries that are affected and the activities that are affected by this airline crisis. Because I've heard from some important hotel people who are dramatically affected by the consequence of this. And if we're going to fix their problem, we've got to get people back in the air. And the way to do that is the things we talked about earlier. So I think, again, we need to focus very clearly on where are the lever points in our economy and make sure we're not treating the secondary or tertiary consequences, but we're fixing the hole in the system that will make everything else work. And I think, again, airlines are really important to that because it will put the possibility of conventions and the like back in place, many of which are being canceled now because people are fearful and the rest of that. So I think we need to work on the clear problem, and the successive ones will then begin to take care of themselves. On the question of the insurance companies, I honestly don't think we have enough data yet, but I think, again, we should follow a principled approach where insurance companies are being called on to fulfill their contractual obligations that they knowingly and freely took. I think we should expect them to fulfill their obligations. If insurance means anything, it means the mutualization of risk and the delivery of payment when certain events take place. So I think on that, we should be clear about that principle. Now,
is that happening too? My indication that is happening.
I think absolutely, Senator. And again, I'm really proud of a lot of people I know in American business because they're stepping up to the plate and they're saying, this is the effect. I saw Sandy Weil said the other day, this is the effect it's going to have in our company. We contracted for it. We're going to pay it. Right. No, we're not asking for somebody to bail us out, in quotes, bail us out. I think it's testimony to how wonderful people are in this country. There are another set of risk, and I think they're more attendant to going forward than going backward in this sense. I think for those individuals and businesses that were at ground zero, you've already taken some action. You all took the initiative in taking some action to give us resources to deal with some of those things very directly for the human beings that have been hurt or killed, and for the businesses in the direct impact area. But going forward, we're going to have to, for example, back to the airline example, we're going to have to figure out how we can mutualize, I think, on a societal basis, the risk that's associated with terrorism, because no insurance company in their right mind is going to leave an opening in policies they write going forward that exposes them to that risk. And I think we need to fix that.
We did talk. Phil and I have already been having private conversations a bit about what we might, some suggestions, and we'll be in touch with your shop about it.
But I think this is the way we should think about it, Senator.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, you know, one of the problems we've had in the past is that the insurance companies have wanted to put reserves together for a cataclysmic kind of event. And it seems to me that one of the things we ought to look at now, I know it's like after the horse is already out of the barn, but one of the things we might look at as a follow-on is allowing insurance companies to put together this pool of their own money to deal with cataclysmic events in the future. I think that the lesson here might move us towards that solution. And that's something I believe we ought to do as a good government reform as a follow-up.
We've talked about it over the years. In fact, Dan Inouye, Ted Stevens, among others, people from the West Coast, we have had a lot of the huge natural disasters have provoked this discussion, but we've entered a new world here on this. Well, I've used up my time. I appreciate it, and I'll come back. I have some questions for you. Harvey, don't you feel alone over there, Harvey? We got some questions for you.
Senator Allard.
I'm learning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I'd like to commend the witnesses for their quick and thorough response to the terrorist attacks. You all exercised a good deal of authority in doing that in order to speed recovery and to get our markets back functioning smoothly. I wonder if you had any, and particularly I would say the Fed's quick response of injecting liquidity was a critical component, I think, of our economic stability. Do you believe that the authority at your disposal is sufficient from what you have experienced to this point? Or do you think in some way some of that authority needs to be modified or expanded in some way? And I'd like to have you each respond if you have any response to that.
I think our statutory base is fully consistent with our needs.
Okay.
I would just say I think we were given emergency powers after the '87 market crash, and this is the first time we've used them. The only possibility that I can see for additional authority for us is that we have a 10 business day limitation on our ability to provide extraordinary relief. My judgment is that that is probably sound, and it will in all likelihood be enough. But if it is not, then we would like the opportunity to at least let this committee know that we think we might need the ability to expand beyond 10 business days.
We're going to be coming forward quickly. As a matter of fact, I've been so tied up today, we already may have presented to Congress with some proposals for amendments of some existing laws that will give us the ability that we need to share information across all of the government intelligent assets and be able to take blocking action on financial accounts. But with regard to our ability to work directly on the issues related to the market, I think we found that we had the authorities we needed on this occasion.
There's been some news reports that terrorists may have used the stock market to profit financially from these attacks. And I'm curious to know what's being done to investigate these reports. And are there any thoughts that you have in regard to, if this is happening, in regard to how you might address it?
Well, let me say that we are aware of those reports, and there is a agency effort underway under the leadership of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but my agency is actively investigating reports of possible terrorist activity. The difficulty, of course, is in going through a lot of records and dealing with foreign transactions as well, but I think our enforcement division, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is proceeding with alacrity to try and find out whether there are any violations of law.
We're working with Harvey.
Mr. Chairman, I'm finished.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Allen. Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you all for being here. Yesterday in Detroit, we had an excellent meeting with Secretary Evans and Secretary Chow and leaders from the automobile industry, other manufacturing CEOs, and top levels of organized labor. It was an excellent chance to talk about the manufacturing sector, what the concerns are, the needs are. And there were two issues in particular that were raised of great concern that I would appreciate your responding to. One relates to the issue of credit. And while we know that there will be a fine line between being cautious about in terms of loans to troubled industries, there's a great concern that there not be an overreaction in terms of reclassification of credit or access to credit when in fact that is not warranted. So there's a deep concern about balancing what happens to credit availability. And then the second thing relates to Chairman Greenspan, what you talked about in terms of the borders and the border crossings. Our industries are very much involved with just-in-time supply processes, and we have hours of delays now at the border in terms of the security inspections of trucks. And while we know that security is the top priority right now, we are deeply concerned. And Secretary O'Neill, I would welcome your thoughts regarding how the Customs Service is going to address this challenge. We certainly understand about the need for security, but this is becoming just a critical issue that has directly involved layoffs of workers and very difficult challenges for our businesses.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Senator. I have a 5-page report anticipating that someone would care to ask about this question, and it's up to date. It's through yesterday morning's peak hour activity. When this issue was first brought to my attention last Friday, the claims were that there were lines as long as 18 miles backed up at the Windsor Tunnel in Detroit. And that Port Huron and Buffalo that are the mainline alternative routes into the country from Canada for the automobile companies, especially for General Motors. I was astounded that these queues had formed, but as I investigated, what I found is that we in the Customs Service and the Treasury had immediately on the passing of these events gone into what's called a level 1 alert. And that means the intensity of investigating every vehicle that comes across the border is raised enormously from normal practice. And indeed, we hadn't at that point gotten to the stage of trying to balance traffic that was coming at us by letting the manufacturing companies know the length of the queues between these alternative routes. Well, I'm happy to report, and you probably know this, yesterday morning, the longest queue and the longest delay was at the Windsor Tunnel, where it was still 60 minutes and 1 mile. But it was the longest delay in the northern border crossings between the U.S. and Canada. And I think we put more resources on the issue. I think we're doing this more cleverly as we understand how to work with this heightened security concern. And as I look down the list of Port Huron yesterday morning during the peak hours, there was a 10-minute delay with a, you'd be interested how precise these things are, 300-foot queue. I wonder if somebody really measured it. But in any event, I think We understand the problem. As a former manufacturing person, believe me, I understand just in time. It's one of the ideas that has created the huge productivity that we've had. We understand it. We are going to do everything we can to drive these numbers back to a very small minute delays, but we're not going to reduce security. We feel we must make sure that we're not letting components for bombs and explosive materials come into the country. That's got to be our first priority. But we understand and working with the automobile companies, and I guarantee you we will get these levels down so that we are not the probable cause of any person being out of work or any manufacturing process being stopped.
I appreciate that very much and look forward to working with you on that. We're very concerned that, first, that we do focus on security, both Customs and INS. We're concerned that there has not been enough focus at the Canadian border as the focus has been at the Mexican border rather than at the Canadian border. But we're just very concerned that this be a sustained effort, as we know that we have to sustain our security efforts, that the increased staff that is necessary to guarantee that the improvements that you've already talked about, and I'm very pleased to hear that, we want to make sure that people are continuing to focus on that, because this is a tremendous entree to the country in terms of commerce and critical to so many of our industries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Stabenow. I just make the observation, we can have very intense security, no lines, if we have sufficient personnel and clearing points. Now, I know you can't ramp up to that immediately, but in the long run, we can have much tighter security at our airports and at the border, much more thorough check, not create a backup problem if we're just willing to make the investment in terms of increasing the number of clearance points at the facility. It seems to me sort of simple. I hope I'm not missing something. I know this ramping up getting the people is something of a problem, but other than that, isn't it, there's a fairly clear solution to this problem, is there not?
I think, Senator, in immediate need, there's no doubt that there are as long as the system is designed the way it is, more people is an answer to reduce the length of the queues. But again, I think as we go forward, we should not freeze in place what I would hope are temporary solutions where, with the use of technology, for example, working with, say, Rick Wagoner at General Motors and figuring out a way that we can bond shipments at the plant before they're ever shipped so that we can scan them electronically and have electronic interlocks so we know they were not opened in transit. They could go sailing through border points without a further inspection. So I think we need to leave ourselves open to ingenuity and innovation and not simply fix the problem that we have today as though that were a permanent fix.
Well, I think that's a good observation. Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Building a little bit on what Senator Graham said earlier about everybody, all 285 million people in the country were affected. I want to concentrate for just a minute on some of the small businesses that were affected, because I'm from Wyoming, and under a federal definition of small business, there isn't a single big business headquartered in Wyoming. And those small businesses are facing a lot of problems as a result of last week. Some of them are regional airlines, some of them are charter services, some are crop spraying companies. But it gets into the peripheral businesses that provide meals, the ones that run little shops in airports, and even with big business. What economic incentives do you think need to be provided to avert further weakness in the economy? And that's in recognition, too, that small business is about 90% of the businesses of the country, and they don't have nearly the flexibility in the money market that the big companies do. They're very limited and don't have as many sources. So are there any incentives, economic incentives, that could be provided to avert further weakness in the economy?
Going to be first or second? Go first. The chairman decided I should go first. Again, I understand your concern, Senator, and it was really brought home to me, you know, in the impact area by seeing a story, I've forgotten which channel it was on, and showing the effect on a deli in the shadow of where the towers had been, and the impact that this has right there on the site where this person's relied on 20,000 people in the workforce there coming in and getting pastrami on rye, and both the physical damage and the lack of business is a real thing, and for many small businesses that live on pretty thin cash flow, this is a crisis of substantial proportions. And I think you can't help but, for them and for the people you're talking about in Wyoming, you can't help but having an ache in your heart for what this means to everyone around the country, including in small businesses. You know, my first prescription would be that we get as close back to normal as we can, as fast as we can, by dealing with some of the direct things we know that we've discussed at length, the airline industry. And I think that has a ripple effect into other kinds of businesses. We need, as best we can, even though it's never going to be the same, to return to a sense of normalcy in American society. And then I guess I would say, honestly, I think we need to do this diagnosis that underlies what both Chairman Greenspan and I have said about what, if anything, we could do that would be not a grant of relief, which we're going to have to take away from Mother Mary. It's really a redistribution function and give to somebody else. It doesn't really create much economic value. We need to think hard about what is the problem, and I'm not so sure yet what is the problem. I was really sure before September the 10th that the problem we had in our economy was related to the investment side of the equation. The consumers were quite strong, and many industry sectors were operating close to record rates. You know, I went into my friendly clothing store in Pittsburgh before this and said to him, "How's your business?" He said, "Well, that's not very good." And I said, "Well, compared to what?" And he said, "Well, last year was a record year, and we're only running at last year's rate." You know, and there was a lot of that in our economy. But if you look at why we were running slow because the investment rates that had been in our economy in technology, particularly in telecommunications and computer technology, were off by 50 or 75, in some cases of individual firms, off 100% from the year before. And so that if we had the same economic circumstances today that we had on September the 10th, and you said, what should we do? Well, I would say then, and I did say then, that I think we're going through a normal correction and we should stand by. Circumstances have changed since then, and I think we need to have a period of time to assess if we're going to make an intervention, where do we make it? Consumers have been strong, and I think consumers will be strong again when they get their feet underneath them and they start going out to dinner at night again and doing the normal amount of travel and don't spend so much time looking at the tragedy that we keep seeing over and over again. And I'm not yet ready to tell you a final judgment, but I think if we're going to do something, one thing that would be helpful to do is some intervention, perhaps, that would provide some support for the market value of America's enterprise. What I mean by that is this. If you want to know what establishes the value for an individual company or for all the companies in America, we now have a very refined capital investment process. And the judgments that investors are making are judgments about the future free cash flow and what the value is of that future free cash flow That's what determines market capitalization. And what we're seeing right now in this move from, let me use the Dow Jones Industrials as an indicator, movement down from 11,000 or 10,500 to yesterday's close, I think, was 8,600, is a judgment that the future values of the discounted cash flows are 20% lower than they were. Now, how can we intervene to create the prospect of higher future free cash flows? Well, one way to do it is to reduce the pressure that companies have from paying taxes. That's not my answer at this point, but as I analyze the problem of how do we create some stability for market capitalization that represents our economy, that's where I look for that purpose. And then the second issue is what action can we take that will more quickly than otherwise happen restore confidence and expectations so that consumers go back to buying houses and cars and clothes and all those other things they have an ability to do, rather than retrenching and holding back, they proceed with confidence about the future. And again, we need 10 days or 2 weeks to think deeply about these things and not just fire the shots that we happen to have on the shelf from past thoughts about these things.
Thank you.
Senator,
my time has expired, but
Senator, if I could just add one comment to that.
Chairman Pitt.
I think that the need of smaller-sized companies, and particularly with a large local following, also requires us to think in terms of what impediments we impose on those companies to be able to raise capital in a more efficient way from people who have a better idea of what the nature of the business is, those in their locality. I believe that there's a fair amount that the SEC can do to try to streamline the process without obviously jeopardizing investors, but that would give smaller companies a lot more immediate access to sources of capital based on their record of performance and their prospects.
thank you, and thanks for the concentration on small business.
Thanks very much, Senator Enzi. Senator Bai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I have 3 questions. My first attempts to look down the road a little bit after we're through this initial period of, as Chairman Greenspan mentioned, physical disruptions, and anticipate what other risks may be out there for our economy and the global economy. In particular, I'd like to ask a question about Argentina and the risks of contagion in the developing world. As I understand it, the recent action by the IMF has gotten a window of opportunity for Argentina to attempt to implement its austerity program. They have an election campaign coming up, and we all know how those things can be. Might not take more than an ill-advised remark on the part of one of the leading candidates to cause a run on their banks. In any event, as I'm informed, as possibly as soon as 2 or 3 months, we may see what their prospects are. So my question is, if at some point in the not-too-distant future it becomes apparent that they may not be succeeding, we obviously hope that they do, but they're facing either a potential default or a devaluation. What are the risks to the global economy from such an event? Will it be limited to Argentina, Brazil, possibly Hong Kong that also has a peg? Or will it go beyond that? And what, if anything, should we be thinking about in terms of what action, if anything, could be done? So what are the risks and what can we do?
You don't even want to think about this, Steve. This is a subject that, aside from the tragedy of last Tuesday, was on the top of our work list, and it's not. It's obviously not at the top. Certainly not in the same sense that it was a week ago. But we're paying close attention because as a consequence of what happened here and the recalibration of capital markets all over the world, the Argentinian premium to U.S. Treasuries has moved back up again to something over 1,500 basis points over where we were on September the 10th. Now, I have to say at the same time, that it was 1,800 basis points until the IMF intervention of a few weeks ago. And I'm sure you must know, Senator, because of the depth of your question, that we in the U.S. Treasury have been working very hard with the IMF to see how that we can be helpful in situations like Argentina's and like Turkey's, for that matter, and the other places that you've mentioned that are, in some sense, problematic. To see if there isn't a way that we can invent new devices that work better and that don't result in effect, socializing to the world a process of bad decisions by sovereign governments, which makes a lot of sense to me. I think we should be prepared to help, and we in the United States should help developing countries around the world, but I don't think we should ask our taxpayers to pay for a continuation of obviously bad decisions by a sovereign government. Now, one of the things that we've encountered in working with the IMF is this, that the securities that have been issued by the sovereign government in Argentina have provisions in them that make it very difficult to use leverage as a way to solve the Argentinian problem instead of tranches of $30 billion or $40 billion or $50 billion worth of taxpayers' money from here and other places around the world. And so one of the lessons that we're learning out of this process is the need to work with governments around the world to make sure that they don't create blocking actions in their issuance of securities, so that when they get into this kind of situation, it's possible to segregate the debt obligations they have and in effect take part of their debt obligations to, let me say, a AAA balance sheet, so that the IMF can use its ability to raise money at 3% to help a government get out of a very difficult situation, instead of giving them money to support their ability to pay 18 or 20% interest rates. And as recently as Monday morning, I had breakfast with Horst Kohler from the IMF and said to him, I think now is the time that we need to take the action that's been talked about for years that's never been done. We need an agreement on an international bankruptcy law, so that we can work with governments that in effect need to go through a Chapter 11 reorganization instead of socializing the cost of bad decisions. So, on the one hand, yes, we're paying close attention to Argentina. There may be some additional necessary action. We're working to see if we can't create the circumstances to use leverage rather than huge amounts of additional money. And we're going to work hard and hopefully successfully to put in place things that people who follow these things have known for decades we should have done. Maybe one of the consequences of this tragedy is we'll finally take action on some of these things we know we need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You've raised a number of interesting issues. I'd love to follow up on it some other time. Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. I only got to one question.
Well, let me say this. I know you staked out 3 questions, and that's been done in the past, of course. That doesn't mean you get to use all the extra time you want in order to get your 3 questions in.
I'm new, but I'm resorting to using the old tricks.
Why don't we do this? We'll give you another question. The time has expired.
I'll be very brief.
I want to ask members to be brief on their questions and the panel and brief in their responses. And let me outline for members what we intend to do. We want to complete this panel. We'll go through a round. Hopefully we won't use a second round. I'll try to forbear. I know others have questions, because I intend to go on and do the next panel continuously, not to recess and go over after lunch. So we intend to have the exchange people who have come down, some from New York, to be with us, follow right on the heels of this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Why don't you take one
I'll be
more
very
question,
brief.
and then I'll come to Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. And Mr. Secretary, I would just say I look forward to following up with you at some appropriate point. It just occurs to me that these are important issues that have been with us for some time. This is a most inopportune time for further shock to the global system, and so they may come to the forefront in the next couple of months. Chairman Greenspan, if I could just look down the road again a few weeks, And I agree with everything that you said and the Secretary said about the need for patience. It's better to act wisely than to act quickly, as I believe you said. Looking down the road, if we are confronted, and my question gets to one of economic policy and the possibility of fiscal stimulus beyond that required to respond to the immediate tragedy, both the defense aspects and the reconstruction aspects. And here's my question. In some of the press, it's been reported that in the last couple of days, long-term interest rates have begun to rise a little bit in the anticipation of the federal budget surplus not being as large as had been expected. And I'd like to ask your opinion about from an economic policy standpoint, the risks to the economy in the short run, the benefits of fiscal stimulus, and the potential that they would be offset by higher interest rates and the effect that that would have on capital expenditure. So my question very directly is there not some short-run risk to the economy to completely abandoning fiscal discipline? And we may be confronted with some of these issues in the next several weeks.
Indeed, there is, Senator, and it's an issue which I did discuss with your colleagues, the leadership, yesterday. It's apparent, at least to some of us, that the extent to which the capital gains, both realized and unrealized on homes, has contributed to consumption expenditures this year has been a major prop that has offset, at least in part, some of the very major contractions that we've seen in the capital goods area. The cause of that is twofold. One, of course, we've had a fairly extensive increase in prices of homes, but more importantly, and this is relevant to the issue of house turnover and realized capital gains in homes, which is a major factor in extraction of equity for personal consumption expenditures. That has occurred largely because mortgage interest rates have been low. And one of the elements that you point out, which I found disturbing, is that in recent days we've seen average corporate rates, BAA corporates, for example, rising fairly significantly. And while we don't have as current data on mortgage interest rates, they lock in fairly closely to the 10-year yields. This suggests to me that we have to be quite careful, because until we find out whether the rise in long-term rates is merely a reversal of the fairly pronounced decline in rates that had occurred in the weeks previously, and hence is not a significant issue, or whether, as you suggest, it might be a fiscal problem. Until we find that out, we are not going to know what the appropriate balance of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and indeed all policies concerned are, because, as I indicated yesterday, we have to distinguish between gross and net stimulus. Gross stimulus is relatively easy to calculate. We can just look at the extent to which we're expanding federal expenditures or cutting taxes and make reasonable judgments as to what that impact is. But until we can determine what the secondary effects on long-term interest rates are, and hence the negative effects on personal consumption expenditures, and as you point out, presumably on capital investment, we cannot make a judgment as to whether, in fact, a particular package of stimulus is indeed a stimulus. And one of the reasons why I've cautioned about waiting until we can truly segregate the strictly infrastructure problems, which we know are temporary, as they impact on economic activity and underlying demand, we're not going to be able to get a good judgment on this particular question either. And therefore, I would hope that within 10 days, it may be a little longer than, it usually tends to turn out to be longer than we expect, but not a substantially longer period. At that point, we should be able to make the judgments as to what is equivalent flood damage, if I may use that category, and what is real economics. And in the real economics, the crucial question is to what extent is the most recent pattern of rise in long-term corporate rates and presumably mortgage rates a factor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I might note, I think that was a very important question. I think this is a very important issue that we have to address. Senator Hagel?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Secretary O'Neill, as you have ranged out this morning over these unknowns as to where we go from here, what action should we take and consider, as Chairman Greenspan just noted, referencing your comments in your testimony regarding a 10 or 14-day window and probably beyond before we will fully be in a position to accurately assess what we need to do. With that in mind, can you tell this committee if the administration is considering any proposals regarding capital gains tax cuts or any other additional tax cuts?
Senator, I would say we are looking at every instrument that's ever been used before, and some that haven't been used but have been proposed. In the spirit of what I said earlier, of wanting to make sure that we don't leave anything out, but that we fit the solution to a careful diagnosis of what the real problem is. And as the Chairman said wonderfully clearly, to make sure that in the name of trying to do right, we don't actually cause damage. And I must say to you, I do think there are instruments that have been used in the past and some that are suggested that are of dubious value. But I don't think we should rush to judgment about that. I think in the spirit that of what you did yesterday, some of the leadership had a meeting yesterday, and you reached out to Bob Rubin. I thought that was wonderful. You know, we need to take advantage of every smart mind that we can bring to bear on these problems, and we need to proceed in good faith without a predilection toward we already have this tool and we already know the answer, and now's an opportunity when we can go ahead and put it in place without careful consideration of what are the consequences and does it have lasting value to the economy.
Does that mean that that's a yes as far as the administration is considering capital gains tax cuts?
We're looking at every single one of the things that you mentioned as possible things that one might do. Plus, you know, there are many ideas about minimum wages and the supplements for non-taxpayers, and I only offer you that in the sense I want to be really clear in backing up what I said to you. We are not excluding anything.
Thank you. Chairman Greenspan, I was very interested in the section in your testimony regarding trade, and if I might read back a couple of sentences here to frame the question. In your testimony, you said, quote, as a consequence of the spontaneous and almost universal support that we have received from the world, an agreement on a new round of multilateral trade negotiations now seems more feasible. Such an outcome would lead to a stronger global market system. A successful round would not only significantly enhance world economic growth, but also answer terrorism with a firm reaffirmation of our commitment to open and free societies. You noted, I'm sure, that our U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Zellick, had a very direct, thoughtful piece in the Washington Post op-ed section today, which I happen to agree with. Would you care to reflect on this statement in a more defined way and connect, if you will, a little more the aspect of the terrorist reference, stability in the world, economic growth, why that's good, why that might have some impact on what occurred on September 11th, if we can move on beyond where we are?
Senator, I haven't had a chance to read Bob Zellick's piece, but I suspect I could probably write it, so it may not be necessary.
You're assuring us that you didn't write it, though, I take it.
Hardly, Senator.
Ambassador Zellick would be flattered.
Yeah. We have developed a really major and in many respects, extraordinary economic system on a global basis in the last 10, 15 years, resting on technology and the free movement of people, capital goods, and most interestingly enough, during the period we've seen increasing evidence that the interaction between economies has enhanced global growth and indeed the growth of everybody. And I thought that an item I read today, I think, or yesterday, which indicated that despite the fact that we've had all of this major increase in telecommunications capabilities, airline travel has gone up very markedly. Implication being is that you really still have to deal with persons face to face. It's sort of the way the human species functions. The openness of societies, the openness of economies are very crucial for economic growth, and they can be open only if they are not hampered by violence. Violence is complete destruction of the institutions of free markets and of global economic systems. Our system is based on voluntary trade by free individuals. And to the extent that we engage in that, we expand the living standards of everybody. And one thing that I was very impressed with, and I must say, if there's ever even remotely a silver lining in such an extraordinarily horrible tragedy that we confronted last week, it's the really quite surprising coming together of everybody. I mean, I have gotten letters from central bankers, finance ministers from all over the world, and I might add Arab nations as well, all expressing concerns about what has happened and wishing us well. And I was deeply touched by these letters. And I don't know whether or not it means that when you get into a negotiating situation that goodwill tends to spill over. I think it does. And if it does, it means that we can make further progress in an area which I think has done so much to enhance human welfare worldwide since the end of World War II.
Gentlemen, thank you, and please convey to your people, the institutions that you represent, how much America appreciates your leadership and commitment to this country. Thank you. Mr.
Thanks very much, Senator Hagel. Senator Carper?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Like Senator Bayh a few minutes ago, I had 3 questions. He asked one of mine. And I had wanted to delve into why long-term rates are trending up, even at the time that we're seeing short-term rates continue to trend down. I'm not going to go there. He's already gone there, and we'll wait a couple of weeks and we'll come back and re-examine that issue. I would like to go back to points that I think at least 2 of you made earlier in your testimony with respect to what was going on in the economy in this country in the month of August. In the very beginning, the early part, the first 10 days of September. Could you just revisit that for us? And I only want to take a minute or 2 on this, but what was going on in this country, in our economy, during the month of August and in the early part of September?
Well, we were still weak. In other words, we were still essentially flat as we had been since the beginning of the year. But the elements of expansion and contraction were suggesting that at least the early stages of coming out of it were there. One of the major elements was that the rate of inventory liquidation was very high and had not slowed. Now, what we do know about inventory liquidation is if you keep going long enough, you will run inventories down to the point where you cannot continue to liquidate at that rate. And merely slowing the rate of liquidation will, of necessity, assuming consumption holds up, raise production and employment and begin the virtuous cycle which gets us out of these types of problems. I don't want to suggest that we were about to turn and everything for the fourth quarter is going to be a major plus. That was not our view. but our view was that the elements were there. Clearly, retail sales were really surprisingly good considering the fact that this major contraction in asset values outside of the home equity area was still creating some what we have called, as you know, the wealth effect in a negative form. But the system was holding up, as I put it here, I think previously in this committee, that the American economy just kept getting battered and battered and battered, and it was still standing. And indeed, as of September the 10th, it was still standing.
Secretary O'Neill, do you want to add or take away from that?
No.
Good. All right. Chairman Pitt. Chairman Pitt?
No.
Okay. All right. My second question. We seem to only focus on the need for an energy policy when we are sitting in lines waiting to buy gasoline for our cars, when they're having rolling blackouts in California and other parts of the country. Your views. Given the tragic events of last Tuesday, is the need for a comprehensive energy policy for our country, is the need diminished or enhanced?
Well, Senator, I've always thought that it's been a very important long-term issue of this country. Our infrastructure is clearly in difficulty in electric area, in gas pipelines, and a variety of other types of problems that we have. What we do know is the fact that owing to technology, natural gas, which is becoming the fuel of preference pretty much around the country, because of the technology, we are draining our existing reserves at a fairly rapid pace, which means that in order just to keep the level of production at approximately 20 trillion cubic feet, we've got to get ever-increasing levels of drilling and expansion, or find ways of importing increased amounts of natural gas, which, as you know, at the moment is largely only Canada, and there's limits there. But there are innumerable possibilities. There's now, as you know, a big discussion on the pipeline coming out of Alaska, whether it's the Mackenzie River or whether it's going down Alaska. But we have to focus on looking at the longer term, because these take years to do. And if we only address long-term energy infrastructure problems 3 weeks before we need an answer, we're never going to get there. At the moment, the demand for power is pretty soft because the economy is soft. That's going to change. And when it changes, unless we have a longer-term focus on how we put our infrastructure together, how we set incentives and rules to, one, maintain energy security while protecting the environment, we're going to run into trouble. And I think unless we give it very considerable thought, now, projecting 5, 6, 7 years out in the future, we're going to get suboptimal solutions.
Other comments?
I agree with what Alan said.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you
Mr.
very
Chairman.
much, Senator Carper. Senator Bunning?
Thank you. I have 8 questions that I'd like to ask. Now, most of mine have been asked, but I have some additional ones. Senator Allard hinted at this, but I think it needs exploring even more. There have been rumors of international short sales on the day preceding the attack on the United States by terrorists. I would like any one of you to comment. I don't want to jeopardize any investigation you might be making right now, but Secretary O'Neill or Chairman Pitts, maybe you could comment on that.
As Chairman Pitts said earlier, we have a full-fledged investigation looking at the transactions that took place, and we will pursue those investigations until we're satisfied one way or another that there is something to the rumors that have been about, or that in fact these were normal market transactions. I saw in one of the papers of record in the last couple of days someone who did an analysis and said, well, if you look at the change in the ratio of puts to calls for American Airlines 2 weeks before the event and then a change in those ratios moving toward the 11th of September, that you have to factor in the fact that American Airlines had a press conference or issued a press release saying our quarterly results are going to be substantially worse than we thought, and they basically alerted to the market that they weren't going to produce what the market was expecting, and therefore if the share price doesn't move, it's not illogical for puts to significantly outnumber the calls. The volumes that I saw were 3,000 contracts or something like that, and while there's no doubt that there was a major shift in the ratios between puts and calls, it's not clear to me yet from the analysis that's being done that there was there's a huge amount of money at risk, and the question I have asked is whether these contracts have been completed. I don't yet have an answer to that. To the degree they're not completed, I would like to make sure that they don't get completed until we can satisfy ourselves that these weren't done on the basis of pre-knowledge.
But obviously we know who the people are that are doing that.
Well, it's not as easy as you would think, because
well, in other words, a firm might, you'd have to go through the firm.
You start with a firm, and then you start trying to trace back for whom the firm placed an order. And then, because these are very sophisticated things, you find in many cases that you've got to go through 10 veils before you get to a real source. So this is tedious, complex work. Believe me, we are pursuing it.
Chairman Pitts.
Well, I just want to assure you, Senator, we have heard the same rumors, and we have devoted, as has the FBI, substantial resources to tracking down every rumor. If there is any possibility that any nefarious activity took place in our markets, you and the American public can be sure that we are going to pursue it and bring anyone who is involved with it to justice.
Thank you. You talked about the airlines at length and the possibility or the potential of some kind of financial assistance. Could we also include in that financial assistance your representation of the Bush administration's solution to some of the security problems that go with it, like carry-on baggage, like air safety security for the pilot's cabin and the $5 doors that separate them from the passengers on the aircraft. And it's so essential for our American people to know that they're going to be safe. Now, in reaching the destination that they took a ticket for. And so I would insist, before I ever voted for assistance for the airlines of any kind, that there be in place the administration's thoughts also on those type of security measures.
Let me say, maybe the simplest answer is absolutely. And you should not be concerned. You're going to see all of that. It may have even arrived this morning on Capitol Hill. I know we over the last few days we've been working hard on this, and we were solid with what we were going to propose last night, and I honestly don't know whether we've now transmitted to you what we propose to do, but all the concerns you're talking about are addressed by what we want to do.
There's a report today on money laundering and the ability of the federal government to trace money laundering in the support of terrorist acts. And the Attorney General is quoted here. And is there in fact a relationship between money laundering and the fact that terrorists and those who support terrorism move money illegally? And are we looking into that? At least that's what the Attorney General is saying.
Well, we are looking into it. The terrorist organizations that we know about are, as they've demonstrated, clever and adroit. And I think as we chase these individuals and organizations, we're going to find that their assets would not have been caught in the general web of work on money laundering, because the money laundering, it tends to be a function of a drug trade and other illegal activities that produce very large amounts of cash, and then institutions are needed to convert large amounts of cash into book entries at banks and the rest, because it's just not practical to do business or to buy other services for an illicit activity with, $10 million $1 bills. And so that kind of activity gets focused there. Then, I guess I want to be careful not to reveal the intelligence information. But it appears that terrorist organizations have been funded from legitimate sources, what otherwise one would call legitimate sources.
In other words, money raising and all those type of things.
Absolutely. And so I think, frankly, not to get diverted, I honestly think that we can do much better on the money laundering question than we have done over the last 25 years. And Senator Levin and I have had substantial exchanges about that in another committee setting. And I'm determined that we're going to begin getting value for money. I don't think we've done that. And I think the way we can get value for money is by, frankly, using all of the intelligence assets that we have that have been separated in our ability to use them by statute in the federal government. We need to take our own handcuffs off so that we can go after individuals. At the end of the day, for money laundering and for terrorist organizations, it's not like going after a company that does business in a legitimate way. These are very sophisticated operations, but at the end of the day, all of the money laundering activity and all of the terrorist activity goes back to individuals. And I'm convinced that the spinal column of our work needs to be identifying individuals that we suspect of doing illicit or illegal activities or being associated with terrorist activities, and going after individuals in a dedicated, determined way, and either putting them in jail or sending them someplace where they never see the light of day again.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming and giving your testimony today. And I would like to urge the chairman, when the FMOC meeting meets in October, that you continue your reduction in the Fed rate so that we can get our economy back on its feet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Bunning. I would note that this committee had a hearing scheduled on money laundering for September 12th. And in fact, we were going to hear from the Undersecretary of the Treasury, Guruli, as the lead witness. Obviously, it wasn't possible to carry through that hearing, but it is now scheduled for next Wednesday of next week. So, I mean, this was a hearing scheduled well before all of this happened, but we will have that issue before the committee on next Wednesday. I want to thank the panel. Obviously, we could go on at some length, but we have another panel to follow on. I do want to say that
Mr. Chairman, before you close out, I want to...
Well, let me just withhold on my final remarks. Are there any further comments that members of the committee want to make, or maybe questions they want to leave with the members of the panel? I'd like...
I'll make comments and then submit some questions, because we've got to get to the second panel. But just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I raised the issue of the unemployment compensation issues, and I raised it in the context of several questions. And Mr. Secretary, you're nodding your head, and I take it to mean that that's going to be a part of the array of issues you look at on how we can help. These are the people. We talk about airlines. We need to obviously concentrate on people there. That's one. Small business obviously is part of that. I received a notice in the middle of the hearing here that a major business in my state, one I know you're both all familiar with, United Technologies Corporation, received word today from their insurance underwriters that they intend to pull their insurance they provided to United Technologies on aircraft at leases to various domestic and international airlines. Their plans are, if that's the case, then they're going to notify these airlines not to fly. So you could begin to see the ripple effects of all of this. I don't know, presumably when you're looking at the airline, that's an immediate issue that would require some attention. I don't expect you to necessarily answer it for me here today, but it's yet one more wrinkle as we look at these questions. Chairman Pitt, I just wanted to raise, I'll submit these questions in writing. These actions that you've taken, many of them are temporary actions, but ones that raise the easing of company buybacks, the accounting firms, their ability to assist their clients to put together books and records, obviously things you had to do. I don't disagree with any of the steps, but the question of how long those actions will be taken, what period of time, and what other actions you may be planning on taking, and who's taking advantage of them. I think the committee, particularly maybe the subcommittee, might be interested. Senator Enzi and I, on that subcommittee on securities, might be very interested in getting more detailed with you about some of those things that have occurred. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to make these points. On the capital gains tax, I was going to raise this with Chairman Greenspan and Secretary O'Neill. I would be concerned about exacerbating any selling off. Obviously, the obvious concerns we have without providing any kind of real stimulation to the economy as a result of any kind of capital gains tax cut. I think a case to be made for some sort of credits for payroll taxes, getting back to that small business that may be affected. If we're looking at some things that might be done, I hope you'd consider something like that in the alternative, in my view. But then again, I want to subscribe to the point you made at the very outset of these hearings, and that is take some time and look at all of these matters. And I know you'll stay in touch with us up here, all of us who care about these issues. But again, I thank you immensely for your testimony, all of you today.
Secretary O'Neill, I think your observation at the outset that this crisis not be used in an effort to take off the shelf matters that had sort of been held up or stymied or were highly controversial, in which there were strong arguments on both sides, is very good advice. I'm moved to make that remark in view of the Senator Dodd's comments about the capital gains. It seems to me at the moment we've developed a very good consensus way of working here in the Congress and between the Congress and the executive branch. It seems clear to me we want to sustain that until we move out of this period. Then, obviously we will resume differences over what policy should be. That, after all, is what a democracy is all about. We're certainly not going to close that out altogether. The other is, Chairman Pitt, I understand you're monitoring very closely to see that no abuses take place with respect to the special rules you've instituted for a limited period of time. We obviously urge you to continue that. Gentlemen, we thank you very much. I want to say we hope at some opportune time to resume or take up the hearing on financial literacy. I've talked about that with all of you, and we all agree it's an important matter in the long run, and we want to come back and visit on that. But again, thank you very much for coming, and again, our appreciation to all of the people who work with you, your staff, who just mounted a very dedicated effort, and the response under pressure, I think, has been very impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now go to our next panel, and we're very appreciative of patience.
Okay. Say hello to him.
Paul.
You look great.
Hey, Dick.
Oh, the little ones.
Dick.
Oh, great. They're wonderful.
Yes. Come on up and say hello.
That's good. Very good of you to do that.
Lover? Yes, sir. Come up and say hello. It's a long hike to get down.
very much. I'm sorry about your waiting. You guys have done a great job.
Great to see you. Congratulations on the
Wick, how are you?
Senator.
Hello. Good to see you. Sorry we
Hello, Wick. Nice to have you with us.
Good job.
Glad your support.
Thanks
Great
for
job.
coming
You guys
down.
did a great job.
Yeah.
Terrific. How'd you get down?
I tried.
What time did you leave? What time did you leave? Did you take a later train? The committee will now turn to our second panel. I think our witnesses are well known to members of the committee, but we're very pleased that they've come to be with us on relatively short notice, and I'll be very quick so we can move to their statements. This panel will be Richard Grasso, the chairman and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange. I think it's clear over the last 2 weeks that he was the right man at the right time for the job he was in. In fact, former Treasury Secretary Bob Rubin was quoted in the New York Times this week as saying, quote, "Dick is exactly what they need now. He's ideally suited to this," and I would agree with that assessment. Wick Simmons is relatively new as the CEO of the NASDAQ stock market, having been appointed to that position on February 1st of this year, but he's done an excellent job of helping to coordinate the industry's response. And of course, few people bring more experience to market disturbances than Bob Glauber, who authored the Reagan administration's recommendations in the aftermath of the October 1987 market break. And many of his recommendations, which were adopted by the Congress, have come into play in this situation. And so he obviously that was a very significant contribution. I want to say just one word and to try to put a little bit of this into perspective. First of all, the New York Stock Exchange on Monday handled a record 2.37 billion shares, as I understand it, up from the previous high of 2.09 billion shares, which was back on January 4th. The NASDAQ volume was a hefty 2.23 billion shares, but that's shy of its 3.1 billion share record. But I think, and I gather the exchange on yesterday exceeded the previous record, the 2.09, by a slight margin. The point I want to make there is it's an exceedingly impressive accomplishment that, having experienced what took place, that you were able to put the markets back into shape to handle these record volumes. And our congratulations, commendations go out to you and your colleagues. The other thing I want to point out, and I think it's important, is a drop in the Dow on Monday is the 14th amongst the average worst percentage declines, well short of the 23% plunge that we had on Monday, October 19th, 1987. I don't say that to minimize it, because it's still significant, but just to get it into some perspective so people can understand that the bottom isn't simply dropping out of everything. And in the course of your remarks, I think it'd be helpful if you could get some of that perspective. I think the same thing is true of the NASDAQ. I think its a drop was the 11th or 12th worst percentage drop. So it's not, it's not even in the top 10. Again, I don't want to minimize it. On the other hand, I think it's important for people to understand that in the picture, the overall picture, this is not at the very end of the spectrum in terms of what's being experienced. Senator Aller, do you have any comment
No, Mr. Chairman, I'm anxious to hear from the witnesses.
Senator Dodd?
Well, just to echo your comments to all of you, you've done a fabulous job in the last 8 or 9 days, and we'll hold you up here a bit this morning. Apologize for the first panel, but you can understand the tremendous interest in the questions, and obviously we have some for you as well. Other than that, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to commend Wick Simmons for the vision that NASDAQ has had in locating its offices in Connecticut and Maryland. This was a very smart and wise and thoughtful decision on the part of this organization, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity for commending him for that along the way. We thank the good job your people have done, too.
It's not my intention to embark on the controversial matter. It won't be necessary for you to answer that, Mr. Grasso. Senator Enzi.
I included my statement or my comments in my opening statement.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, we'd be happy to hear from you. Why don't we start with you, Dick, and we'll go straight across the panel.
Well, thank you, Chairman Sarbanes and Senators Dodd, Allard, and Enzi. And thank you particularly, Mr. Chairman, for those very kind words. This is a collective that I'm very proud of that you'll hear from in this panel. I want to thank this committee, and particularly you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Dodd, whom we communicated with during the middle of these discussions, which led to the resumption of trading. And most importantly, to all of the members of the committee who I know were very supportive of the efforts, the collective efforts, I might add, of the markets and those in government who oversee the markets. I'd be remiss, Mr. Chairman, if I didn't at the outset say that all that was accomplished since the great tragedy of last Tuesday could not have taken place without the wonderful stewardship that we in the private sector had from this committee, from you, Mr. Chairman, but also from Secretary O'Neill, Chairman Pitt, Bill McDonough, President of the New York Fed, and so many others in government who really were inspirational. And I would be terribly remiss if I didn't say that without the incredible visit of our President, the Herculean efforts of our mayor, that lower tip of Manhattan would today still be in a chaos, and I'm afraid that we would not be in a position to, as we did this past Monday, resume trading. Mr. Chairman, the attacks of September the 11th will be ingrained in our national memory forever. The NYSE was not spared as an employer. 3 of our members, hundreds of our member firms' employees, and a number of my partners were either killed or at risk. Thousands of others displaced. Everyone in this country has lost a family member, a friend, a cherished co-worker. We are all, some almost 300 million strong, impacted by this heinous act committed against our way of life. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of these horrific crimes that were perpetrated not only in New York City, but here in Washington at the Pentagon, and certainly over the skies in Pennsylvania. The attack on the World Trade Center hit particularly close to home, since, as I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, 143 of my employee partners at the NYSE were housed in the Twin Towers. Thank God, all escaped safely. But one thing is certain: the United States remains the greatest democracy and economic power in the history of the world, and all of us are committed to ensuring that this remains the case. Our capital markets are privileged to be a part of that tremendous economic engine. I'm very proud of the resiliency that our markets have demonstrated in the face of this heinous crime committed against America and all Americans. Never, Mr. Chairman, in my 34 years at the exchange have I witnessed a truly remarkable partnership evolve within minutes between government and industry, with the sole purpose of bringing back order to our nation and, most importantly, economic stability to our capital markets. The 3 principal equities markets, the senior managements of financial institutions, our 3 principal government overseers, all came together to make, as never before in our history, a singular objective possible: restoring our markets instilling confidence in the investor populace, some 85 million strong in this great nation, and most importantly, reassuring the general public, doing all that we could in this new collaborative to send the message to the terrorists, to those murderers, that our nation was unified, our economy strong, our market functional, and they, the criminals, had indeed lost. Last Wednesday, a meeting convened in Midtown Manhattan. In attendance were SEC Chairman Harvey Pitt, who I might add demonstrated incredible judgment and skill in making certain that the private sector, not the government, restore the markets as quickly and as consistently with our objective of providing the best markets in the world. At that meeting, Treasury was represented by Undersecretary Peter Fisher, each of the CEOs of the major markets, Wick Simmons, my colleague, Sal Sedano, the CEO of the American Stock Exchange, all in attendance, as well as CEOs of the major financial services firms, representatives of the federal government's FEMA team, the state government, the great Governor George Pataki's team on the scene, and of course, our wonderful mayor and all of the ancillary services of the city government played a major role. The subject, very simply, Mr. Chairman, was reopening our markets under the face of incredible carnage. Anyone who has been to the financial district since the tragedy can attest to the enormity of the challenge that was faced. And I would say to those who have only seen it on the film clips, nothing can be more horrific than being there in person to understand what those wonderful people, those innocent Americans, were subjected to. If the business of my market, Mr. Chairman...
Nick, just one point on that, and I apologize for interrupting. I'm told there were people from 62 other nations.
That is correct.
Lost their lives that
Senator.
day. And I repeat that often enough because it's important that there were Americans, but there were a lot of other people.
A message well delivered, Senator. This is not just the loss of American lives. 62 nations from around the world had representatives in that building, or the series of buildings. If the business of my exchange was solely the result of convention of 3,000 people on a trading floor, Mr. Chairman, trading would have resumed immediately, since the exchange and its technology sites, one in Lower Manhattan, one in an outer borough, were unhurt by the attack. But our business today depends on interconnectivity. Some 300 broker-dealers who introduce the orders of some 85 million Americans from around the country, and certainly many more from around the world. Thus, a complex communications and data delivery network that spans the globe and is hubbed in several sites in Lower Manhattan with the challenges of restoration. The decision to restore trading on Monday also gave our telecommunications providers critical time to establish the connectivity necessary to deliver that network of services. Brokerage houses and their customers around the country depend upon multiple points of access to the world's largest and most liquid marketplace. However, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I should add and underscore that resumption of trading on Monday or the prior Friday, or indeed the Thursday, would not have taken place until and unless we were all confident that the most important objective of the recovery exercise, which was the search for those who may have survived and the recovery effort for those who have perished, would in no way be compromised by the restoration of our infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, I need not say it, but I will for the record. It is life first, stock trading second, all Americans I know share that perspective. Mr. Chairman, the utter declaration of war upon America, in my view, has united us as in no time since World War II. Judged in the light of what we've been subjected to, the temporary interruption of our capital markets, I believe history will rule to be insignificant. Our prayers and heartfelt thanks must go to the brave heroes of New York City's fire and police departments, the Port Authority Police and Emergency Medical Services, and so many here in the capital area and in Pennsylvania who put themselves at risk in the pursuit of saving lives. Their heroism was matched time and again, Mr. Chairman, by those who are now crawling through the rubbles to hopefully bring another person out alive. Nothing in our business was going to divert or in any way impede that effort. Once the issues of rescue and recovery and human life were dealt with, the focus obviously became restoring and resuming the finest markets the world has ever known. Our goal was to return the market as quickly and as efficiently as possible to the levels of historical deep liquidity and investor protections that are the hallmark of America's free market system. Stated differently, our measure was to be in a position to serve the American investor with the same level of excellence they have come to expect for the past 200 years. Together with our partners from the SEC, the Treasury, and the Fed, we all knew the public's confidence in our capital markets would in part depend upon the prompt reopening of our equities markets. Unnecessary delay would mark a concession of defeat to the enemy who sought to disrupt our ordinary course of conduct. In the 6 days following the attack, Mr. Chairman, the NYSE, in partnership with the other markets and in a truly Herculean partnership with the city and state, FEMA officials, our central technology provider, the Securities Industry Automation Corporation, Con Edison, and most importantly, Verizon, the major communications provider for that hub in Lower Manhattan, worked continuously to restore the connectivity of America's markets, those who introduce business to those markets, and those firms to their customers. There was extensive testing literally from the moment the system went down until the moment trading resumed. Virtually every aspect of that interconnected network, markets to firms, firms to customers, the so-called introductory of trade to the clearance, comparison, and settlement process were indeed verified to be functioning as we would all want. I'm very proud, Mr. Chairman, of the hard work and determination that the public and private sectors coming together in an unprecedented partnership were able to produce a market that, as you quite rightly point out, Mr. Chairman, these first 3 days of the trading week in the collective are the most active in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and approach the most active in the history of NASDAQ. The best evidence of our success in this wonderful collective effort, you point to Monday's most active day in our history. Reopening of our equity markets, again, Mr. Chairman, as you point out, while down some 7% on Monday, 1/3 the level of the experienced decline on the 19th of October in 1987. Our equity markets are strong. They've returned to their strength. And while prices are down, I think the important message we've sent, Mr. Chairman, the platform of economic freedom in this country, the markets that we have crafted over the course of 200 years are intact. And the criminals who attacked our people and our property while they took the lives of so many and destroyed the property of so many, they were completely unsuccessful in taking the spirit and idealism of this great country. They failed, Mr. Chairman, miserably. Their failure was poignantly delivered to the world at about 9:33 on Monday morning. At that moment, after the singing of God Bless America, less than a week following this heinous crime, representatives of New York City's fire, police, emergency medical services departments, the Port Authority police, flanked by Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki, Senators Schumer and Clinton, Treasury Secretary O'Neill, SEC Chairman Pitt, New York Comptroller Carl McCall, and my market colleagues, Wick Simmons, Sal Sedano, so many others, watched those four brave heroes ring the opening bell and send a message to the criminals who declared war on this country that they've failed. The decline in markets continues, Mr. Chairman, and some may be concerned, but as we heard this morning from the first panel, America is strong. Our economy, while at levels perhaps not of a year or 2 years ago, is still intact and strong and will indeed provide the necessary platform for economic growth to resume at the traditional levels. I would caution those who believe the downturn to be long-term or to be a permanent phenomena, that 11 years ago, when Iraq moved into Kuwait, the Dow Jones declined to the 2,400 level. Some 9 years later, it was at 11,000, Mr. Chairman. Anyone who bets against this great nation of ours is flat wrong. The foundations of our equity market are strong, the will of our people unified. The government has come together as never before in a common pursuit, victory. Victory will be celebrated by our people, by our economy, and ultimately by those in the markets, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the wonderful leadership and support that you've given as this committee oversees our markets. All of the members either spoke with or sent expressions of support to those of us in the very critical task of restoring the public and the investor confidence levels to what we've now indeed been able to accomplish. Mr. Chairman, I want to say all America is shining brightly, and our equity markets will one day reflect that. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Dodd, Senator Allard, Senator Enzi. For those of us who were unfortunate enough to witness the tragedy, nothing I describe today will approach the ultimate sacrifice of the thousands of Americans in New York's financial district and on Washington on September 11th. We honor those who fell that day and convey our deepest sympathies to their families and their friends. If destroying the U.S. financial markets was a mission of our enemy on September 11th, that mission failed. The enormous efforts of the past week demonstrate the vitality of the U.S. capital markets. I've been part of this industry for over 35 years, and I've never been prouder of my colleagues or my city than I have in the last 10 days. As was true throughout the financial community, the men and women of NASDAQ rose to the occasion. Our New York City office at 1 Liberty Plaza is the worldwide headquarters of NASDAQ and sits directly across Church Street from the World Trade Center. When the tragedy struck, our first responsibility, like Dick's, was to ensure the safety of our employees. Once they were safely evacuated, we assured ourselves that our critical technology facilities were undamaged. In coordination with the SEC and Dick, We then determined that trading in the equity markets should not open until the attack's impact was fully understood. We then began the process of evaluating the extent of any damage to NASDAQ and our market participants and determining the necessary steps to reopen the market. We were guided by several principles. First, we would do nothing that impeded the rescue effort. Second, we would closely coordinate all our activities with the city and with the SEC. Third, we would open our market only when the other markets and major market participants were fully prepared. Finally, we would be as open and transparent in reaching out to and assisting our members and issuers in crisis as we are any other day. As to NASDAQ's technology, at no time during this disaster were NASDAQ systems inoperative. At the time of the attacks, trading was suspended, but NASDAQ systems and network continued to operate. Because our primary and backup technology centers are outside Manhattan, our primary concern was our ability to connect, as Dick said, with the firms that are active in our marketplace and provide our liquidity and order flow. NASDAQ's geographically decentralized network has several levels of redundancy designed to withstand singular point failures. Virtually all firms are connected to NASDAQ through a set of several NASDAQ servers on their sites and in their backup centers. Each of the servers in the NASDAQ network is connected to 2 distinct NASDAQ connection centers. There are more than 20 NASDAQ connection centers located throughout the United States, 4 in the metropolitan area alone. Each of these centers is connected to both our primary and our backup data centers. While this may be a lengthy description, it's critical to understand that disasters such as these, and we've never seen a disaster quite like this, are not averted by hardening any single point of failure. Rather, they are avoided by having resilience built into the network through backup connections and backup vendors. This is a key learning from this tragedy. While many of our 393 market makers and ECNs were not physically impacted by the disaster, many others face great challenges in terms of personnel, technology, and connectivity. That said, firms representing over 60% of the daily volume of NASDAQ confirmed their operational readiness by noon on Wednesday. We also reached out to the 4,300 companies that list their shares on NASDAQ. To enhance prospective liquidity, we recommended they look at buyback programs and get board approval if necessary. And I might say here that the SEC's speedy action to ease these rules was critical to us at that point in time. We reached out to the SEC and other government agencies as they reached out to us. The unprecedented cooperation between all market centers with local and national governmental authorities was continuous and excellent throughout this period. I want to commend the federal, state, and local governments for their willingness to use their vast resources and regulatory powers to assist the markets at this time of crisis. The SEC and the City of New York were particularly instrumental in helping us open the markets as quickly and smoothly as we did. All hands were truly on deck. In my view, the decision process to reopen the markets was a textbook example of effective cooperation among the market, government, and private industry. Telecommunication, power, and employee access problems created enormous complications and risks in reopening the market. In addition, there was total unanimity among all participants that the equity market should open as quickly as possible, but only when we could ensure that they could operate efficiently with proper liquidity available, without additional constraints, and with universal access for all investors. We also believe that given the uncertainties, it was important for investor confidence that all markets open simultaneously. After 2 all-hands meetings, and Dick described one of those before, and with the strong leadership and resolve of Chairman Pitt and the full support of the SEC, the Department of the Treasury, the Federal Reserve Board, the decision was made that trading should resume no later than Monday, September 17th. This decision was based on 3 factors. First, through the efforts of Verizon and MCI WorldCom and the affected financial firms and markets, there was a geometric improvement of telecommunications connectivity each day. Second, the critical importance of the continuing rescue operation at the World Trade Center site made provisions for widespread physical access to financial firms and the New York Stock Exchange floor and an earlier startup inappropriate. No one wanted to get in the way. Third, there was complete consensus that the market should not resume without widespread system connectivity testing, which could most effectively occur over the weekend. NASDAQ employees also facilitated communication between the markets and governmental authorities. Beginning on September 12th and every day until markets reopened, we hosted frequent conference calls with all major national market and exchange participants, including the SEC, other regulators, FEMA, the equities, futures, and option markets, and all related clearing agencies. These calls were critical to the speedy progress we made in restoring our markets. NASDAQ employees provided technological support to over 800 NASDAQ and non-NASDAQ participants, including market makers, order entry firms, ECNs, other markets, and even some foreign markets seeking to reestablish their local connectivity. Many firms had to activate their disaster recovery sites, which presented special technological needs. The testing of systems that occurred over the last weekend played a critical role in our confidence in the opening on Monday. On Saturday from 9:30 a.m., like Dick and the other exchanges, NASDAQ brought up our trading systems as we would on a normal trading day. The testing included firms represented nearly 98% of a normal day's volume and was a great success. In fact, everybody took it so seriously, we had literally did 20% of an average day's volume in a test. That's unheard of. Monday was obviously a go. To achieve the successful reopening of the markets, NASDAQ, the government, and the financial services industry all worked in concert. The strength of the U.S. financial markets today reflects the cumulative efforts of far-sighted leadership many years ago, and it continues. It was this effort of cooperation that saw us all through those 8 days and restored the markets as we have them today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob, we'd be happy to hear you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dodd, Senator Allard, Senator Enzi. First, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your kind comments at the outset. On behalf of the NASD, I want to thank the committee for inviting us to appear here on what is clearly a very vital subject. It's vital because the barbaric acts of September 11th were an assault not only on our country, but on our financial markets. I'm here to tell you how the broker-dealer industry has responded to these attacks and to describe its condition in their aftermath. Under federal law, the NASD is a self-regulatory organization for every one of the more than 680,000 registered representatives in the U.S. securities industry, and all 5,600 brokerage firms that are the pipeline connecting investors to the markets are also monitor all trading on the NASDAQ stock market. All of which has given us a graphically detailed perspective on how the industry was affected by the horrific events of September 11th and how firms are getting back on their feet. The picture we see is both inspiring and daunting. We have found stories of heroism and humanity. One key firm, it was discussed earlier, lost 700 of its 1,000 employees, took a vote to stay open, and worked through the night to do so. Countless markets and firms, ordinarily the fiercest of competitors, have cooperated like the closest of friends. There are some telling numbers. There were 31 main offices and 30 branch offices of broker-dealers located in the World Trade Center. We have been able to communicate with almost every one of them. Much of our work in this crisis has been to fashion reasonable regulatory relief wherever and whenever appropriate. We are also working closely with the SEC and others to ensure that the rules governing our markets and members are applied with appropriate flexibility. And we are answering a great number and variety of investor concerns. Hasten to add that in every step we have taken, we have continued to put investor protection and market integrity first. And I can report that there has not been 1 minute since the attacks when our ability to monitor trading on the NASDAQ stock market has been compromised. At this time, we have received no reports from customers unable to locate information about their accounts. This is largely due to the existence of duplicate records located at clearing firms, service bureaus, and backup sites. We have posted on our website contact information for every one of the firms so that they can be accessed by customers. So that's been our bread and butter, but some of what the NASD has been doing has been terribly far from routine. Some 500 floors of office space in Manhattan have been knocked out. So we have created an electronic clearinghouse where firms that now need office space are finding firms with space available. Other firms have suffered losses so catastrophic they have decided to become branch offices of other brokerage houses. We are smoothing the path as those firms seek to find suitable partners. And we have undertaken one service which is truly heartrending. NASD records are often the best source of fingerprint images for those lost in this tragedy. With appropriate safeguards, we are providing thousands of images for identification purposes to member firms, law enforcement, rescue, and recovery authorities, and of course to the victims' families. Senior NASD officials have spoken already to hundreds of brokerage firms in Lower Manhattan. We hope soon to get through to every one of the 350 additional firms south of 14th Street. By and large, the firms are all full of courage and resolve. But make no mistake, September 11th brought an undeniably heavy blow. We pray for all the friends and colleagues we have lost and all the families who grieve. It's why we must celebrate the miracle, which we've discussed over and over again today, and which we should never take for granted, that the most liquid, transparent, and trusted markets in the world are back in business. And remember all the heroes who made that possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We thank all the witnesses for extremely thoughtful statements. Again, I want to commend the extraordinary cooperative effort that was undertaken within the private sector and between the private sector and the public sector. And the resolve and the determination and the judgment which were shown, I think, merit the praise of all of it. You had difficult judgments to make, difficult calls, and I think you made them right. And you know, we're back in operation. How close to normal are the operations in terms of how effectively it's working?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would say from a systemic standpoint, the best and most visible way of answering is to simply look to the volume levels we've processed, and it is clearly indicative that our system is strong, and the capacity that we have all invested in, which is many times the average utilization rate in my own case, we've got approximately 5 times our daily demand embedded in our network. So the technology investments of the last dozen years have paid dividends for all markets. I do think we would be remiss if we didn't recognize, Mr. Chairman, that markets function based on the performance of technology and people, not just people in Lower Manhattan, not just people on trading floors, but those in the distribution network. And it is clear that it will be an adjustment period for all Americans, and certainly for those who are in the traditional financial district before they're able to focus as they did prior to the 11th of September. But again, I believe that this effort that Bob and Wick I have described to bring back the marketplace, to bring back our people and our technology and focus on being the world's admired capital market that we've been, will be part of the healing process.
I would only add to that really the exchanges, as you know us, as you see us up here, are in better shape than many of our members, and that we still have 4 or 5 major members who had their facilities located either in the Trade Center or the World Financial Center right next door, who are now either operating out of 650 rooms at the Sheraton uptown or out of disaster recovery sites in Connecticut or in New Jersey. So for them, it's not business as usual yet. For us, it's much more that way.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the 1987 stock market crash, and just as a point of comparison, in that event, 600 million shares proved more than the exchange could operate. As you pointed out on Monday, the exchange did New York Stock Exchange did 2.4 billion shares. What's clear is that the lesson from 1987 was well learned by NASDAQ and by the New York Stock Exchange, that capacity has to be in place so that the markets can function and investors have confidence. And it was well learned, voluntarily put in place, and served us so magnificently on that Monday.
I think that's a very important observation. I take it that you've taken in the Amex and they're working off of your floor. Is that correct?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. We took a page from the tragedy back in 1989 when the earthquake hit San Francisco, where the equity markets and the options markets basically on an almost overnight basis invited the professionals from the Pacific Stock Exchange who were based in San Francisco. It was their options business to relocate it to other markets. Ours included, we built a floor for them. We took that basic model, and immediately after the tragedy, the top management of the American came to see me. I showed them some open space, which we had decommitted last year. They committed to me that they wanted it, and we literally built them a trading floor between Wednesday and Saturday, which was tested, fully functional. We trade all of their equities and their exchange-traded funds products, and we relocated their options business to Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman, we are actually the owners of the Amex, that is the NASD, and I just want to thank Dick for all the efforts he undertook. It really was in the finest traditions of commitment to each other in these times of crisis.
And I understood from a comment you made before that you've not, up to this point at least, encountered a difficulty in terms of the destruction of records because of the backup systems that exist. Is that correct?
That's correct. Most, certainly large firms, have disaster recovery facilities, as has been discussed. Other firms clear through third parties, either service bureaus or clearing firms. And it's only the very smallest firms and those that have very little business with the public where there would be any question. And to our knowledge, there have been no lost records.
Senator Enzi?
I'd yield to.
I would do Senator Dodd and then.
Thank you very much. I thank my colleague for doing that. And let me.
Senator Dodd and Senator Enzi are the chairman and ranking member of our subcommittee on securities.
Well, I just want to, it just deserves being repeated of just the tremendous job that all of you have done. And Dick, we all watched you all week up there through this, and it was, I love the way you put this morning to us. Obviously, the human dimension comes first, and the fact that you made a decision that there was about all that could be done on that level, and that was going to trump any decision about opening the markets, as important as that was. And I know that's been said before, but I appreciate you restating it here this morning. It's tremendously important. And just really, it is. And what Senator Sarbanes has said, I mean, you think you've had both the largest and second largest day in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in the last 3 days in terms of volume. And the fact that under these circumstances you've been able to handle that volume is a great tribute to you and your staff and to the brokers and dealers and specialists and so forth on the floor up there who are, you know, as I say, I made these calls to folks in my state, very difficult calls. I didn't know what else to do except to, you know, we're down here talking about things we're going to do legislatively. But in the meantime, I'm sitting there and so decided to make the calls to some families. I didn't reach everybody in my state. I don't have numbers for everybody, but talked to about 40 different families over a space of some 12 or 14 hours. And the overwhelming majority, of course, were working for these firms that you're talking about here today. That's where they were. There are a couple of, you know, tragics. A young girl, 24, down to a job interview, all excited about that new job she's going to have. And up there for that interview that morning, just pure fate. A young kid out of Columbia, from Ridgefield, Connecticut, just so excited about his new job in the financial services sector. 23 years old. Absolutely beloved kid in his community, and Columbia's classmates out with his picture up all over the city, hoping beyond hope they might find him. Just one tale after another. Let me, just one point. I don't know, this isn't really, I don't know, you're here, and so I want to raise it with you here, but it's really not your jurisdiction in a legal sense. And I know these firms want to get back going, get the technology up, and get the money going. But I hope in your positions of leadership, you'll be talking to these folks, too, about these families. You're talking about people who have given tremendous, their entire professional lives, in some cases here, to these firms, usually limited partnerships in some way, something put aside there, but hardly what you consider adequate to be raising families of 4 and 5 kids down the road. And I don't know how you do it, but I mean, for those of us sitting here who kind of want to watch, they know they got an obligation to get the business going, and they got to serve their customer base and so forth. And if obviously the ways in which we can help in that regard, we want to, but I hope you would convey, as I'm sure you have, and they have too, publicly I know have been talking about it, but you know what happens over a period of weeks and months, you know, memories fade a little bit and people are back and trying to get things going, and sometimes that mother, that wife out there that's got 4 or 5 kids and only met anybody at a social setting, annual dinners and the like, becomes a secondary and a tertiary thought. And I just hope that they're going to remain very paramount in the minds of all of this. That human dimension, Dick, that you talked about, that as important as it's been over the last 10 days, will remain paramount in the thinking that goes on. The only real question I have for you, other than for you maybe to respond to that particular point, is just if you might share with us, and you don't have sort of a floor, Wick, but nonetheless, people obviously, but on the floor, Dick, I always say the last thing you want to do is be talked about on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. You're in trouble if you're being talked about. But there's always a chatter that goes on. Try and share with us, if you would, just the mood of the people on the floor. What are the last 2 or 3 days, if you can sort of capture that for us a bit here.
Well, Senator, you'll be and the committee members will be, Mr. Chairman, very happy to learn that a large part of the discussion is about people, is about not just those in the financial community who have suffered a loss, or to this point, many still missing, of loved ones or colleagues, and what can be done, as you say, Senator, long after the shall we say, glare of the camera is gone. Although I would say to you, at least in my business, this is something that will never lose its glare. They're talking about the cops and the firemen. They're talking about the people who were running up the stairs as well as the people who were running down the stairs. They're talking about how we as a community, and recognize that the entire nation is talking about the same thing, how we can wrap our arms around those who will need our strength, both in guidance and prayer, and, as you say, Senator, financially. The mood of the market is truly secondary to the mood of the people factor on the floor. Everyone's concerned about the psychological impact that's been suffered. Anyone who was in the middle of that horrific day, and certainly anyone who was in the street, to see the streets of Lower Manhattan turn black at literally 10:30 in the morning, we'll never forget that. And so we've got to provide adequate counseling, the blanket, as my colleagues and I have called it, of human support. As far as the market, in my closing comments, Senator, I think there is an observation that's important. As we faced the conversion of Desert Shield to Desert Storm, the market was falling from peak to trough about 20% over the course of 7 months. No one was concerned about the market as much as they were concerned about the troops and the effort and the success. And I believe that people today on the floor, to your question, and many of your constituents, of course, I see each day, they're concerned about our effort to never let this happen again, okay? To root out, not just to do something that is an immediate feel-good, but to find where the roots are and kill both the plant and the root, okay? To make certain that we win in the most universal of sense. Your wonderful recognition. 62 nations lost citizens, not just America. And this is about making the freest market and the freest society take a global action in partnership with all of those nations to make certain that this never happens again. The market, as we heard from the first panel, the economy, will recover. It's the greatest experience on earth. It is the human factor and the safety factor. And I'm very pleased, Senator, to where you started your observations. I'm very pleased that no one has ever, for the moment, lost sight of people first, commerce second. Take care of the people, commerce will take care of itself.
Wick or Bob, do you want to add any comment to that at all?
I'd only add one thing, and that is that what Dick's talking about is something we have to extend out for a number of months now. Because what's happened in New York is it was a physical tragedy, but it's an emotional wound. And it's an emotional wound not simply for the people of New York, but for all people at the moment who somehow feel their security has been threatened. When they feel their security has been threatened, they pull their hands and arms in and turn into themselves and to our close friends, what have you. And I think it's going to have, unless we speak to it, a profound effect on economic behavior for a few months here. So this very wrap your arms around people approach, which Dick was talking about, I think we have to think about in terms of the solutions that we provide from Washington and or other places in these next few months, because we've got to repair a wound which is difficult to do. You see that in the markets right now. You know, markets at times like this are one part reason, 2 or 3 parts emotion.
Yeah.
And you have to let that come out. So we got to, what we say, we have to speak to that emotion, not just simply to the facts. That, in turn, I think will create the kind of equilibrium necessary for markets to start to really regain their footing.
That's important. And, you might, with Senator Enzi and I here, if either of you or any of you here have some thoughts and ideas on what we can do as a subcommittee, obviously in conjunction with Senator Sarbanes, the chairman of the committee, to work at this, or to come up with some ideas and thoughts on how we can play a constructive role. We'd be very, very interested. I know I speak for both of us here in doing that. Bob, any quick comment on this at all?
Just simply to say I expect to take you up on your invitation and talk to you about things that can be done. We've spent, as you can imagine, a lot of time talking to the leaders of a number of firms in the business. And inevitably the talk starts about what we can do and what they're doing to continue running, and inevitably turns to colleagues they've lost. And it reminds you over and over again that this is just a human tragedy before it's a business tragedy.
I thank you, too, for we've done it all the way along. Sarbanes, Senator Sarbanes, Paul Sarbanes did it, and you've done it in your opening and these comments, too, Dick, and that is those policemen, those fires, and those EMF service people. I know a number of people from around Stamford, Connecticut, went into New York, as they did, I know, from New Jersey and elsewhere, and the thought, how many times I've heard of those stories, those firemen charging up the stairs of that World Trade Center, and at the 30th and 40th floor, trying to get up to deal with that immediate crisis as people are coming down, and to know that 400 or 500 of these people, whatever the numbers are, is just incredible. We saw the tragedy in Worcester, Massachusetts, when 6 firefighters lost their lives, and the outpouring people felt then. And the dimension of this is just, the human aspect of this is so hard to grasp that I don't think, in fact, I'm glad we don't in some ways. The human mind is not capable in the short term of understanding the magnitude of a tragedy like this, and we're protected in a sense from that as a result of it. It'll take time for us to really understand how profound an event this was. And I think, Wick, your comments are so appropriate that we've really got to work at this. We talk about children reacting to this, and adults need to too. And boy, if we don't do that very well, as you say, the wounds will heal in that sense. But the deeper aspects of this, and I hear folks today, one and two, I think some of our colleagues who are flying back, they were the only person on the plane coming back from their respective states. Eerie feeling and coming across the country. So our confidence has been damaged, but it's coming back, and an awful lot of the reason it's coming back is because of what you three have done, and as you would say very quickly, that literally hundreds and hundreds of people you work with every day that are restoring some confidence and faith in these markets. And Senator Sarbanes, I thank you immensely for holding the hearing. I would have liked to have gone on that trip up to New York today to be with our other colleagues, but I think we thought here this was maybe our most important job, to be here today and to provide a forum so you could tell us what's going on, what has happened, what steps are being taken, and to tell Americans out there and people throughout the globe, we're back. We're still a little damaged, but we're getting stronger every hour, and we're going to be more vital than we ever were before as a result of it. I thank all three of you.
Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to extend my thanks for your taking time out of what is the fourth open day of the markets to come down here and spend some time with us and with the American people. And it's our hope and my belief that your appearance here today makes a difference in the market and with the country. It is reassuring to have you personally tell what's happened and what is being done. And I really appreciate the leadership that you've shown through this, the American ingenuity of putting everything back together. And because of your testimony, we have a little better idea of the complexity of what had to be done and that miraculous testing that went on over the weekend in light of all of the things that people would have rather have done because of the tragedy. And the cool way in which you counseled each other and talked about when the appropriate time would be for opening, and the way that you communicated with us on the opening so that we also could communicate to the country that it was a normal process in light of what had happened, and could give what reassurance was possible there. Without your leadership, your preparation, that would not have happened. But also without the people that worked with you. And again, I appreciate all the communication that your staff provided to me and people that work with me. And one of the things that this tragedy has shown, I think, is the importance of every single person. Doesn't matter what the job is, we've learned that we are dependent on all of those other people. Regardless of what their specific talent is, they're all part of a major puzzle for this country, and no place else could it come together like it did here. I heard of a pilot on a plane yesterday who, in his little speech at the beginning, encouraged everybody to visit with their neighbor a little bit because they're going to be family for a few hours. And if it's one thing that's come out of this tragedy, we're all finding out that we're family, and we're going back to a retail atmosphere in this country. We've been at kind of a wholesale situation where we look at people as groups of people, and now we're looking again at them as individuals, and in some instances meeting them for the first time. So I do appreciate all you did to keep everything running and then to get it back up to full speed on Monday. Something I am curious about is some of the costs that were involved in this to the exchanges themselves, both the cost of being closed down and the cost of starting up. Have any of those been put together yet? And if they have, can you give us some kind of an idea of the range of that?
I must say, in all candor, Senator, and I thank you for those wonderful comments, costs were never a factor. It was restoration. If I begin to quantify at least my own market, we turn on an average day about $46 billion over, against which our yield, against which that would produce an average day of about 1.2 billion shares. Our yield on that as an engine, or if you will, as a source of revenue for the exchange, is roughly $109,000 per million. But there was never a there was never a focus. There was never a focus, and to the credit of everyone, not just the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange, all of the firms who basically opened their doors to one another, it really was never even an issue of, well, you know, this is going to be expensive. And it was the American people, 85 million investors amongst them, directly using the markets. Let's get them back up and running. And we'll worry about the cost later on. I think that the real cost here was in human life and in human suffering, and no one can attach a financial statement to that.
I would only add to that to us, it was more important, as Dick said, to get the markets up and going, because ultimately, if people lose faith in our ability to operate markets, i.e. they can't vote financially at times like this, then we pay a far, far greater penalty down the road than we pay today. So there really was no concern for that whatsoever on member firms' part or on our parts. I think it was simply to get up what it is we do, which is provide, you know, a field of play, if you will, with complete integrity that people can trust and vote economically in.
I would just echo what Wick said. The cost will be very large, both in interrupted business and in damaged and lost facilities. But people haven't been thinking about that. They've been thinking about getting the markets up and running and taking care of each other and taking care of those that have been hurt, killed.
In light of this kind of a situation, another thing that's extremely easy is hindsight. And I want to congratulate you for the foresight of having the off-site backups that you had that definitely aided in getting this going. In light of the tragedy, will you be looking at additional backup sites for the respective exchanges, or?
Well, Senator, I'll speak to my market. We've got a distributed technology network. The question of physical distribution, clearly right now or prior to the tragedy, we had 3 pieces of real estate on which we could trade. We happen to trade only on one. We've now, as a result of our new partnership with the American Stock Exchange, have a 4th. And I think we've already had the 2 of us the thought that we might take on additional alternative sites, so that to the extent that several physical facilities are in some way damaged or incapacitated, that we never lose the ability to bring the market up. I should point out, however, as I think you'll recall from your visit to the campus recently, 92% of our orders, which produce about 53% of our daily volume, are done on our electronic commerce platform. They're not in need of physical convention. So at a minimum, we could jumpstart the market on that basis. But with sites in Lower Manhattan, the American Stock Exchange, and one in an outer borough, we think we've got the right direction looking forward, but we don't preclude perhaps 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, NASDAQ has no floors, as you know. I mean, it's all electronic, but that doesn't mean that we don't have facilities that we have to be sure have the ability to migrate whatever it is we process on those facilities to another facility. Primarily, we need hardware and the ability to move our software and our connectivity, our network connectivity to different sites around. And you can bet that we will put extra emphasis going forward into making sure that those sites are regularly tested, as well as backup sites in name only.
If I could just do one more quick one for Mr. Klauber.
Sure.
On September 14th, you issued a telemarketing fraud alert. I'm not sure whether the country is aware that that's a role that you play. What's been happening in that fraud area?
We did, as you say, Senator, put an alert up on our website to investors, as we have done on other issues from time to time. What I can tell you, fortunately, right now is that we've had no evidence specifically of that going on. We considered it to be a great danger, and we wanted to alert the investing public to it. and we'll just keep our eyes wide open on that issue as days unfold.
Thank you for that role and everything else that you do. And again, thanks to the leadership of all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Enzi. Well, gentlemen, we thank you very much for coming and for your patience. I think it was important for you to be here, and we know it was on a short notice that you responded to the committee, but we thought it important to have both this panel and the previous one in terms of giving people a better understanding of what's transpired, what's going on right now. I do want to say again that I think you and your colleagues certainly rose to the challenge. The competency and judgment that were reflected, I think you can take a great measure of satisfaction in. I was very much struck by the priorities that were reflected here today in your testimony, your concern for the human dimensions of this tragedy. It's enough to make you weep when you think of the talent and the dedication of the many men and women, young and old, that were caught up in this and whose lives have been taken from us, and the loss that that represents. Your self-regulatory organizations, and as I indicated to the chairman of the SEC, we desperately hope that no one will seek to take advantage of this situation in some way, and I know we'll be monitoring that very closely, as will the SEC, and hopefully anyone inclined in that direction can put it to one side at this moment of challenge. We look forward, as Senator Dodd indicated, in working with you and with Senator Enzi and any suggestions you have as to further measures that might be taken to strengthen the system, make it more ready and more prepared. I'm struck by the fact that, as I indicated at the outset, that many of the recommendations that Bob Glauber put forward after the 87 occurrence came into play now and were of importance. So, you know, if there are lessons to be learned here, we stand here ready, of course, to work closely with you in a cooperative fashion to implement that. Finally, I'm going to take just to impose on people for just a moment, because I want to read actually into the record this very fine statement, in my view, that the New York Stock Exchange printed in Monday's New York Times, which I think actually reflects much of what you said here today, but that, of course, went all across the country, and I thought it was a very sensitive and perceptive statement. And as we close, I'm going to impose on people, it's not very long, but I'm going to impose on people for a moment or two to actually read it into the record. At 9:30 this morning, a bell will be rung on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and trading will resume as it has for 209 years. Today, that bell means more to us than just business. It will also be sounding out our deepest thanks for the bravery and sacrifice of so many who unhesitatingly came forward to give so much in this difficult time. It will ring out our heartfelt prayers for those we have lost, their families and loved ones. It will steel our collective determination to never let cowardice, intolerance, and evil sway this great and free society from its strong and sure course towards a better tomorrow. We will go forward from here, stronger in spirit and purpose, knowing that history has proven the ability of our financial system to survive the darkest challenges time and again. We will do our utmost to preserve the best serve the bedrock foundations of worldwide prosperity and well-being. And we will sound that bell and let freedom ring. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Hearing's adjourned.
You too, Bob.
I'm glad you
I stayed.
Oh, you stayed?
And it was worth it.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
This hearing took place at the Hart Senate Office Building on Capitol Hill. As we take you outside of the building and to a live picture of the U.S. Capitol,